Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell. You'll get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And when I'm not asking Bruce, hey, how big was Batista's? Well, you know. One of the things I like to do is help people save money. And if you're watching this video right now and you're in a 30-year loan, man, you're overpaying your single biggest bill and you may not even realize it. I want you to do a little experiment for me. Take your calculator out, multiply your monthly house payment by 360 payments. That's how many payments there are on a 30-year loan. That big scary number, that's your total of payments. You're looking at that number? You know you can do better. Keep more of your own money right now and go to savewithconrad.com. Or maybe you've got credit card debt. Man, it's not a matter of if I can save you money with that. Your average interest rate on a credit card is more than 20%. And by the way, all the interest you pay on those credit cards, it's not tax deductible. Whereas the mortgage interest, well, that is tax deductible. So if you owe this debt, it's up to you how to pay it back. Doesn't it make sense to get the cheapest rate possible and the greatest tax deduction possible? Find out how much money you can save right now for free at savewithconrad.com. You don't need perfect credit. Even scores in the 500s can be approved, and it's no cost out of pocket. But maybe best of all, we're licensed in more than 40 states. We can help more families than ever before. But how much can we save you? Find out right now for free with a quick quote from savewithconrad.com. Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and you're listening to 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. Eric, what's going on, man? How are you?
I was blown away this morning. No, okay. Literally, I was blown away this morning. I got up to 60-mile-an-hour winds.
Whoa.
I mean, I went to sleep last night. I went to bed early too, because whenever I know I'm going to do a podcast with you, I want to make sure, I don't have anything to drink, 24 hours before. I get at least 7 or 8 hours sleep. I eat right, right before I go to bed. I have brain food. I mean, I do all these things to get ready for the show because it's such an important thing for me. And I have so much fun doing it. But I went to bed last night. It was about 8:30. And usually I fall asleep within about a minute and a half, tops, 2 minutes. And I felt like I was sleeping in a train tunnel. The wind was so loud and so strong. And it's going to be that way for about another 18 hours, according to my weather app. But yeah, I walked outside because my office / bunkhouse is on the property, but it's about 30 yards from the main house. I turned around the corner because the wind is blowing from the north. I turned around the corner and walked into the wind. And I could have easily been in Utah by now. I wouldn't have had something to grab onto.
Wow. Well, I don't know what I was expecting. When you said blown away this morning, I thought there was news. No, physically, we're going to have to tie your ass down out there.
Oh, really? It's funny. My dog, she had to go out and take a dump this morning, right? She goes about 20 yards from the back of the house. And she's trying to take the dump and the wind's blowing her over. It was crazy.
Well, I'm excited that you and I are getting together today because we've got some big stuff to talk about. On our calendar today is Ravishing Rick Roode. And Rick Roode is, in my opinion, maybe one of my favorite heels of all time. I was going to say one of the greatest heels of all time, but I guess that's debatable. But to me, buddy, he's right at the top of the list. And as we're talking tomorrow, or as this show drops tomorrow, this Tuesday, December 7th, would have been his birthday. Of course, unfortunately, we lost him in April of '99. And there's a lot to unpack about Rick Roode. I don't think we can even get all of this into one episode, but I don't think that he gets enough discussion in the modern era. People always talk about, who was the greatest wrestler to never win a world title? And I guess we could say that the big gold belt when he carried it was the world title, but really it was the international championship. They had another world title in WCW at the time. But in my mind, he's right up there at the top of the list with the all-time great heels like Mr. Perfect and Ted DiBiase. And he could give you a great match. He could give you a great promo, but he just had a presence about him. Did he not, Eric?
He did. And Rick's presence, the way he carried himself, I'm not going to say he lived his character, but there wasn't a lot of difference between the Rick you'd see on camera and the Rick you'd see backstage. On camera, obviously, the volume was turned up a little bit on that character, but that same presence as you characterize it as, that same presence, that charisma, that attitude. It was like it was, you could almost see it. It was an aura about him. And he was a very interesting cat for sure.
Well, we're going to do our best to talk about him today. I don't think we can get through his entire career, and we're not even really going to try, but maybe this will wind up being part one. We'll see how it goes, because I just love talking about Rick Roode, and his story, at least with you, started way back in 1991. You at the time are front and center as an announcer for the debut, and then the Sting title switch. This is years before you're quote unquote in power. You're just happy to have a jersey, as I think you used to call it, a C string announcer.
Yep.
But Halloween Havoc, 1991, we would see the Halloween Phantom pin Tom Zink in like a minute and 26 seconds. But then later, there's the big interview with Paulie Dangerously, and Rick Roode is going to unmask as the Halloween Phantom and reveal he's Rick Roode. And then there's Medusa as well. And what do you remember about that night? The excitement of Rick Roode, who, when we had last seen him, was working on top with the Ultimate Warrior, the WWF champion, and had a great run with Warrior there. Obviously, maybe not so happy with the way things turned out creatively or financially. He's here now in WCW. Do you remember that moment when he returns to WCW?
I do. I do. And what's interesting is you describe that so vividly. When I got to WCW, I'd only been there a couple months, right? When Roode showed up, if that. So everything was new to me. Yeah. Everything is like, oh my gosh, this is, because you got to remember where I came from. The studio that I've seen in your offices where Dave Silver works, were not that much of a step down to the studio that we were working out of in AWA. I mean, it was bare bones. So for me, getting to WCW, first of all, I'm in the CNN Center. This Ted Turner, he owns CNN, he owns WCW, and I'm going to work there. I mean, it was such a overwhelmingly cool part of my life. Everything I looked at, everything I touched felt brand new to me. And I had that kind of level of excitement and enthusiasm. I really hadn't been watching WWE during that. I mean, I'd drop in and out, but I was, at that point in my life, I wasn't a wrestling fan for the sake of being a wrestling fan. I was a professional in the wrestling business who happened to have been a fan. Still am to a degree, but it wasn't my priority. So I really wasn't as excited about Rick Roode coming in because of where he came from, because I wasn't really paying attention to where he was at, in WWF at the time. But I had known Rick before I got to work for WCW. I'd known Rick right out of high school. So he was somebody that I was very familiar with on a different, I was more familiar with him, because he grew up, in the area that I lived, and we had some mutual friends and all, and he was a little bit of a legend. I was more excited about that than I was because of where he was positioned on the card. And the fact that Rick was coming in at this stage in my relationship with WCW, where fucking everything was exciting to me. I could go throw paper in a trash and go, oh, wow, that's a WCW trash can. And Ted Turner owns that. Oh, wow, I work for that guy. That's kind of where my head was at. And then to have Rick come in, somebody that I knew, just kind of blended it all together and made it even more exciting.
One of the more really exciting things that happened not too long after he's a part of the program here with WCW. And I said returning to WCW. I guess I should add some context to that. He had been a part of Jim Crockett Promotions and was actually a tag champ when he left in 87. And of course, then he became Ravishing with the whole airbrush tights and the part of the Heenan family, and became Intercontinental Champion and had some main events with the Ultimate Warrior. And now he's back. But the Clash of the Champions that happened just a few weeks after we learned that Rick Roode was here at Halloween Havoc, that goes down. And this is where they had that really impressive attack where Medusa was essentially distracting Sting. Lex Luger comes out and makes the attack. Now Sting is going to be taking to a medical center, and you're doing the phone interview. And of course, then there's the hurry and the worry of, will Sting make it back to the building to defend his United States title? He does make it back, But the old spirit of 76 didn't work out. Rick Roode beats him 4 minutes and 50 seconds to become the U.S. champion. It's a 3-star match, but the angle was so well received. Steve Beverly and Matt Watch wrote the Sting Roode story.
Listen up, muckerfuthers. If you just can't get enough of 83 weeks, we've got tons more waiting for you over at adfreeshows.com. Bonus episodes, all the archives with zero, yes, I said zero ads. Plus, we've got interactive events and experiences with yours truly. You can ask me anything, chat one-on-one during our live Locked and Loaded events. Do yourself a favor. Right now, Google the internet, and you won't find a better value in all of wrestling. Come on, man, you can't beat it. Join the family today at adfreeshows.com.
Line was well carved out, and while it cut into their being able to have a top quality match, Sting sold the leg really well, and the setup with Luger being the box ender set up 2 things. It allowed Sting to lose the U.S. belt without being destroyed, and it opens the door for Luger versus Sting at Wrestle War at the Taj Mahal in February. Paul Lee was nothing short of sensational, particularly when he ripped the coat off and said, "My good friend Jim Herd, it nearly knocked me off the couch." The photography on this show was excellent, and the shots of the ambulance leaving and returning were on par with the WWF. Plus, the Eric Bischoff graphic and telephone report gave the angle a news quality I happened to like. It was either the hottest crowd since the first Clash, or the audio work was much better. Even though hardcores will balk, this Clash proved they don't need Ric Flair to have an exciting telecast.
Ooh.
Memorable moment. What do you remember being a part of this?
First of all, where is Steve Beverly?
You know, he's like out of wrestling completely. Isn't that weird that you had a guy?
That's a shame, because that was a really well written. Now, obviously, it was complimentary, so people are going to assume I only like it because it's complimentary. But it did a really great job of breaking that scene down and giving an opinion as to why it worked and what Mr. Beverly enjoyed about it. Because I could picture it in my head as you're reading that. Very cool. And somebody should find Steve Beverly and get him back into wrestling again, because he'd be a good contributor over at adfreeshows.com. Plug. What do I remember about it? First of all, I remember it happening, but nothing stands out in my mind as being the most exciting part of it. I thought the most interesting part of it, aside from the storyline and how Dusty did such a phenomenal job setting up the chess pieces for what's going to happen in the next pay-per-view or whatever, the way you described it. But I did find the use of the graphic, the news-like graphic, interesting, and partly because I was still so enamored with the whole CNN thing. It was a big deal. When you think about Ted Turner and global news and cable, Ted Turner was such a pioneer, and nothing was more of a visionary manifestation of his vision than CNN, right? So the fact that we were kind of known for CNN, and now we're using a news-like element that felt authentic, I thought that was really interesting, because I had certainly not been a part of anything like that before, at least nothing that was that well done. Run backstage and see how somebody is. That's a different deal.
Yeah.
This was pretty cool.
By the way, here's where WCW was at the time. The card itself drew a sellout, 6,922 fans. Fans were turned away at the door. Dave Meltzer would say the actual paid attendance was somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000, but they could have sold them all out, since we said they're turning folks away. And I know that a lot of times people like to look in this era of WCW and talk about how bad things were. Oh, business was down and what have you. And in 1991, they're not totally wrong. It was not exactly booming. But let me just add context to that. This Clash of the Champions, where we would see Rick Roode become the U.S. champ, gets a 4.3 rating. Now, what does that mean back then? It means they were in 2,460,000 homes. Now, that, again, doesn't sound like a ton to some of our listeners who keep up with ratings these days, but I want to add the context. When you hear 2 million now, they're saying 2 million people, not 2 million homes. And most of these homes are not just single dudes watching TV by themselves. So 2.4 million homes means a lot more people than what is watching wrestling now.
Do you know what the factor is? I keep thinking about going back and trying to find that. But I remember Nielsen published, I wouldn't expect you, I mean, if you know, you're going to just blow me out of my chair. But I think the last time I looked, it was like 1.3 or 1.6. I can't remember which one. In other words, instead of there being one person sitting in front of the television in a single home, the average was like 1.3 or 1.6. So pick a number in between, and that's probably a pretty good factor to estimate comparable viewership.
So process that. We're probably talking, around 3 million folks watching
3.35,
as opposed to 2 million. And we're saying, oh, business is down. It's really not. And by the way, the main event, well, I guess it's not the main event. In my mind, the main event was Sting and Rick Roode here. They got a 4.7 for that. So that's 2.7 million homes. So it's a strong number with a strong angle. And a lot of this is of course, because Sting is a superstar and everyone loves Sting. But now here is this recognizable, established heel who was a star on the other channel. And let's not forget just the parallels of Sting and the Ultimate Warrior, coming up with Rick Bassman together, going to Jerry Jarrett together, going to Watts together, both using paint, both splitting, both going their own way, and both becoming world champs, one in the NWA and one in the WWF in 1990. And now here's the Ultimate Warrior's old rival coming to take on the Ultimate Warrior's old buddy. It's pretty cool. I want to mention, I think Rick Roode had the longest run with the United States Championship that anybody had. He really did make it his title, but ultimately he winds up injuring his neck towards the end of 1992 in the middle of his long run as U.S. champ. So he has to vacate the title. He's out for a few months. And right before he comes back, old Eazy-E is named executive producer of WCW programming. So we talked about, when Roode's coming in, you had barely beaten him there as a C-string announcer. Now he's coming back from injury after this long U.S. title run. And now you're getting a little bit of power for yourself. Did you have in that gap, between, we'll call it late 91 and late 92, early 93, how had your interactions with Rick been?
I mean, the only thing I can remember, it's a little while ago now, but sure. Jen on the set, please. My interactions with Rick were purely social backstage. I really didn't have, because again, people need to remember, if we haven't talked about it, I don't think we've talked about this in a long time. When I was first made executive producer, I had very limited control of anything. Post-production, yes. Things like the graphics that we saw on screen, the type of lighting packages we would use, audio issues, things like that, things that were really hands-on on just the television side of things. I wasn't involved in creative at all. I wasn't involved in talent acquisition at all. I wasn't even in those meetings, and my opinion was very rarely asked when it came to things like creative or talent acquisition in and around that period of time. That changed going forward. So I didn't really have much to talk to Rick about other than, hey, have you seen this guy? Hey, have you talked to Wayne Bloom? Hey, have you seen Norton lately? Been out to the Lord Fletcher's in Lake Minnetonka. Oh, that kind of trivial nonsense. But just friendly social conversation.
Let's mention when he comes back, there are some big plans. He's going to return and challenge Dustin Rhodes for the U.S. title. And then before you know it, Meltzer's going to report the original plan with Bill Watts running things was to have Flair versus Roode at the June Clash. Of course, plans change, pal. I also want to mention he made an appearance on the Howard Stern show, April 9th, 1993. He had Fred the Elephant Boy there, who was a big wrestling fan, and this gives them an opportunity to talk about wrestling in a more tongue-in-cheek fashion. As a kid, I loved seeing Rick Roode on Arsenio Hall. How did you think he did as a representative of professional wrestling and world championship wrestling in the media?
Well, I really have to go back and look at it, to give you a better answer, but Rick, I'll just say this generally. Rick was really good when Rick was being Rick, you know, and again, the daylight between the real Rick Roode and the character Rick Roode, I mean, you could still see a glimmer of light there. There was still some difference, but it wasn't hard for Rick to just turn up the volume and be very comfortable doing it without feeling like he's out there doing a wrestling promo. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why Rick Roode is a guy that we're still talking about and respect to this day. He had an amazing physique. He was strong as an ox, you know, tougher than nails, had the right attitude. Nails the hardware, not nails the character. I mean, although that would have been a hell of a matchup back in the day, wouldn't it? Whoo, doggy. Two Minnesota guys beating the hell out of each other. Get the ticket. But Rick was so comfortable, you know, in just about any environment. I wasn't worried about it. Nothing really stands out about it to me. So therefore it must have been pretty decent.
I want to mention, they even did an article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which I believe came out on May 22nd. And the title of the article was "Pro Wrestlers Can Tell Some Stories About the Dangers of Overzealous Fans." And Rick Roode is talking about how somebody tried to stab him. They threw a blade at him and it barely missed his body because he was wearing this robe and the robe took the deal. But still, he would be commenting here. Not a day goes by that I go out and don't hear someone scream something. People can feel pretty safe on the other side of the barrier. You can walk to the zoo and antagonize the gorilla, but as long as you know he's in a cage, you're all right. The problem is some people get carried away with the character. I hate to disillusion anybody, but we're people too. And the article would say, it's been a relatively quiet 3 years for Roode, who saw a fan leap on his back in the ring before a 15-man lumberjack match in St. Louis. Said Roode, I go down and take my robe off to my music. Before my music ended, someone jumped on my back. I thought it was another wrestler. It turned out it was a fan. If he would have had a knife, I'm sure it would have been all over me. I got hit a number of times, but the guy really didn't do any damage. Police asked him in the back why he did it, and he said he was mad because his girlfriend was cheering for me and he was jealous. This is hilarious. And of course, he played into this a lot with his airbrush tights. On one pair, he had Michelle Pfeiffer quoted as saying he's so bad, and Kirstie Alley saying he's so big, and Gina Davis saying he's so strong, and Christina Applegate saying I want him, and Kim Basinger saying I miss him, and Cindy Crawford saying I need him.
How awesome is that?
It's hilarious. It's great. This character is a 10 out of 10, man.
Oh, I forgot all about that. Oh, I love that. Nobody's ever done that before or since. So
no.
That's a Hall of Fame idea. If WWE is ever going to create another division, I guess, into the WWE Hall of Fame ceremony, it should be a WWE Hall of Fame gimmick. And that would have to be the first gimmick inaugurated. That's awesome.
Of course, he's going to have an interesting match with Dustin Rhodes for the U.S. title. They film it for Worldwide. Both of the guys get their shoulder up, but there's two referees who are each counting the other down. But Rick Roode winds up leaving with the belt. We get to Slamboree and we see Roode team with Paul Orndorff to take on Dustin Rhodes and Kensuke Sasaki. It's only a 2-star affair. It kind of is what it is. They had a strange Flair for the Gold segment because Rick Roode is the guest and he's going to get along great on the set with Flair and Arn Anderson. And it's noted, it came off as if either Flair was going heel or Roode was going face. Their relationship at times was a little hokey pokey, Ric Flair and Rick Roode. Can you elaborate on that?
I don't know why. You know, I don't know what the inciting incident was, what kicked it off. But I ended up getting caught up kind of in the middle of it on more than one occasion. And it was pretty serious. But I really never learned I mean, I probably heard versions of what started it. I don't remember what they were because nothing was ever definitive, but I never talked to Rick about that. And I never, well, either Rick, Roode, or Flair. I don't know what started it, but it was ugly. It was, I mean, there was one point where I had to, and I don't remember what event it was in. I think we might have been in Alabama, or South Georgia, but it was either a pay-per-view or a clash. And something happened, and then we were on our way to, I think we were on our way to Philadelphia for the next big event. And Roode he was threatening to do some damage to Ric Flair. And, Rick wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to not show up. Rick was too much of a pro for that. I don't know what was going through his mind. I don't know if he was afraid of Rick Roode or not physically. He probably should have been. But Roode was, and I tried to calm Roode down. I tried to talk him off the ledge. He'd look at me, but I could tell he was not listening to a word I'd say. He was just really fucking pissed. And I went to Barry Windham, not to take anything away from Arn and, some of the other people that were there to back up Rick, I would presume, because everybody was aware of it. It wasn't a secret. But I just, to make sure, to try to make sure nothing happened, or if it did, that it was stopped quickly. I asked Barry Windham to come down because Barry Windham, he was a badass. He had some respect. He had he had fists like his father, these big fucking hams. So, I went to Windham and said, dude, I don't want to get you in the middle of anything you don't want to be in the middle of, but just in case, do you mind, presiding over the inevitable event that's about to occur in 5 or 6 days? And Barry did, and it worked itself out. There was no physicality, but it got pretty intense. And another one, we'll save it to the end of the show. This is a pretty interesting story that made me a wee bit nervous. So
I have a feeling a trunk is involved, and I can't wait to get there. I do want to talk about the NWA here for a minute because late August 1993 is when supposedly the NWA world champion will be Ric Flair. And the idea being they're going to have this Beach Blast show on July 18th. And somehow, I don't know if it's advertising or promotional materials, the NWA finds out, hey, they're going to switch the title because they're promoting Rick as the world champion in August. But the match where Rick would win that belt, because let's add this as context. Ric Flair was able to get a release from Vince McMahon following his loser leaves match to Mr. Perfect on Monday Night Raw in January of 93. But he's not able to wrestle yet. So they're filling time, at least on WCW programming, with the whole Flair for the Gold concept, sort of like a modern Piper's Pit, if you will. It's an interview segment themed after like a late night show. That's where we would see Fifi the maid, all of that stuff. And eventually we know Flair's going to get back in the ring. So of course he should be challenging for the NWA world title. And that's when things get a little weird. This is directly from the Observer. A monkey wrench of sorts may have been thrown into that because during this past week, the NWA legal representative sent a letter to WCW saying they have no right to change the title without first getting confirmation by the NWA board of directors, which by NWA bylaws controls the NWA belt. The NWA board consists of C.G. Sakaguchi, screwed that name up, Steve Ricard, and Bill Weitz, none of whom at press time had given the okay for the title switch. The NWA threatened to sue WCW if they did the switch this Sunday without permission or advertise Flair as NWA champion without authorization of the NWA board. WCW was attempting to rectify the situation before Sunday, and on the television show that airs on October 8th, Rick Roode came out with the NWA heavyweight title belt announced as the new champion. In tapings in November, Roode still came out with the NWA belt, but was announced by the ring announcer as the world heavyweight champion as opposed to the NWA champion. So I know you're not exactly running all of the legal stuff for WCW, but do you remember anything about this flare up with well, we can't call it the NWA title. And that's when ultimately we get this international championship. But this feels like a monumental waste of time. The NWA was not anything of circumstance or relevancy whatsoever by this point. What were you thinking about this, or what do you remember about this?
I wasn't involved in any of the discussions, in terms of trying to find a solution or resolution with the NWA. It wasn't in my wheelhouse at that time. So I remember there was confusion. I remember there was chaos on our end. On the television end, it's just a matter of graphics. Just make sure we get the fucking graphics right. Whatever it ends up being, however he's going to be referred to, or the belt, the NWA belt is going to be referred to or not, just make sure we know. So we've got our graphics right. That would have been it for me, man. And I agree with you that, the lineage, of the NWA at the end of Jim Crockett Promotions has been so convoluted that even back then in '93, I was like, let's just get this over with. It reminded me of kind of the silliness and the chaos that was happening between, different territory promoters, towards the end of territories. They were trying desperately, Vergania being one of them, desperately trying to work together and figure out these sanctioning bodies and positioning people to all work together to fight against what was going on with the WWE and cable television and talent and all that. But it was so ridiculously not effective. And that's probably why I just didn't pay that much attention to it. It was like, dude, just tell me what I need to do. Tell me what, our graphics need to look like and what we can say on commentary, and we're good. I didn't even have anything to do with commentary at the time. So now take that off the list. So
Dave Meltzer would review the Beach Blast show that we were just talking about. Dustin Rhodes and Rick Roode had a 30-minute match here on the pay-per-view. And he would say that the match hurt the show more than anything else. Dave didn't believe that Rick Roode had the repertoire to do a 30-minute match on pay-per-view and thinks it was a big mistake to do 2 falls. As a rule, maybe I'm in the minority here, but I'm interested to hear your take. I think 30-minute matches should be few and far between.
Oh,
I mean, if you've got a Ric Flair, Shawn Michaels type performer, okay, maybe. If you've got the Rock and Roll Express versus the Midnight Express, again, okay, maybe. But by and large, I don't think I need to see too many 30-minute matches at all. What say you?
Well, and let's talk. Well, I want to break this down a little bit, and we'll go back to the beginning, but I want to kind of get right about in the middle of the conversation here, make a point. A 30-minute match on television would be about 30. You'd have it. How many commercials would you have in there? 3?
At least 1 set, maybe 2.
Well, yeah. And those are what now? 3 minutes long, 3.5 minutes long. So while you're watching a 30-minute match at home, or God forbid, a 60-minute Iron Man match of sorts, the number of times that 15-minute or 30-minute match would be interrupted would take you out of the match.
Yeah.
It would be like if football was continuing to play while you were in a commercial break and you come back and you have an entirely different set of circumstances in the game. It just takes you out. It doesn't work. So I would agree. Now, on a pay-per-view, I feel differently. You don't have the same challenge. You have a different challenge because you got to keep the crowd into the match.
Yeah.
That's the biggest challenge, is how do you tell that story in the ring? Not the narrative of it, but the story in the ring that hopefully has something to do with the narrative. But how do you do that for 30 minutes and hold that audience? You got to be pretty damn good at it and have quite a bit of experience. Otherwise, you lose them. And especially today, if you look at the way we're all conditioned by what we watch or what we listen to or what we read or who we pay attention to. But when you're watching television, you have to watch television at a faster pace now because it's written differently. It's produced differently. Like going back to the NFL has changed their television format over the years and the game that goes along with it to make it more television friendly. They had to. And part of that was keep it moving as fast as you can. And still service the game. Wrestling's the same way. And I think that's one of the reasons why when we watch wrestling now, it is more visual, dynamic visually, and there's less meat on the bone from a narrative perspective, basic storytelling perspective, because everything's so much faster paced. Just a challenge of a television audience evolving. But, and to start at the beginning, I think, the 60-minute formats, the 30-minute formats, great when you have literally a captive audience, at a house show. Go back to, the big events in regional territories. Minneapolis, it was always Christmas or Thanksgiving. There's always that one big event every year. And now you've built it up over a long period of time because there wasn't weekly television where you're trying to bang that story home every week after week after week. So you could build up your anticipation over a much longer period of time. People were conditioned to go to wrestling on, the big Thanksgiving show or the big Christmas show. And so once I got there, you had a captive audience. And you had built that story up, the narrative of the story and all of that. You had built that all up. And yeah, you can pull off a 60-minute match. Where are they going to go? There's no remote, right? Easier conditions. And I think over time, the success of those, a 60-minute Iron Man match or whatever you want to call them, last man standing type matches, great for house shows, not so great for television and even pay-per-view, where people have been conditioned to see things happen at a faster pace. Wow, that was a long answer.
Well, let me make it shorter. I freaking hate Iron Man matches. And this was one of them, a 30-minute draw, one fall each, an Iron Man match that resolves nothing. But when you tell me ahead of time, hey, we're going to go 60 minutes and we're going to see who can win the most falls, or we're going to go 30 minutes and we're going to see who can win the most falls. And
that's a big difference, right?
Well, now I feel like I just need to watch the last 5 minutes. I feel like it's NBA playoffs. Like I don't need to watch the first 3 quarters. I need to watch the last few minutes of the fourth quarter because really nothing else mattered. This is it. And so,
and I'm sorry, but I want to kind of echo what you're saying. For me, I would be really interested in watching that match instead of watching the last 5 minutes. I would want to see how the people, the agents and the talent and the writers who put together that idea and were trying to communicate to the talent how to get it done. I'd love to see the psychology within the who gets what fall when kind of flow of that match. Not because I just can't, I love to watch those style of matches. I don't, but I'd love to kind of figure out what they might have been thinking going into it, because that's a big challenge.
I want to mention Flair is going to pull out of the War Games match on September 19th. And he's going to be replaced by Dustin Rhodes. And now that sets up Flair versus Roode for the NWA title on that pay-per-view show. And the NWA does hold their annual convention on September 3rd in Las Vegas. And of course, this is what everyone is talking about. And a lot of the members like the idea of Ric Flair being the champion once again. And as it's written up here in the Observer, this is where it gets sticky. I surmise that many, if not most, of the non-WCW members of the NWA would rather have Flair as champion instead of Rick Roode. This is interesting to me because I've never understood, because I've read that for years. And I understand that Flair was a legacy performer and regarded as being the best wrestler in the world, and he certainly had history there. But do you think it's that they were anti-Roode because they didn't like his style, they didn't like the gimmick, they thought he was too much of a gimmick? Or was it, hey, this guy was just in main event spots in the WWF and never won the big one, so if he comes over now and wins it here, from a fan perspective, it looks like, well, he couldn't win the WWF title, he's not good enough, but he's good enough to win the NWA. What do you, and I know you weren't involved in the NWA convention, so I can't ask you what happened there, but why do you think, or what do you think the argument would have been against Roode being champ?
I think you touched on it just a couple moments ago. It was style, right? And we have these same types of conversations different contexts, obviously, but these same types of conversations, even today, you know, there are certain people like us, me, you, that talk about wrestling from the 80s and the 90s and compare it to the style of presentation that we see today. I happen to, I don't mind it. I don't find myself when I'm watching today's product, whether it's AEW or WWE, going, oh man, I was just the old days, man. Then back in our day, this is the way, you know, when I was this is what wrestling should be based on the way I looked at it when I was 10 or 12 or 15 or 30 or 50 even. You know, I don't think you should, that was a Bill Watts type of mentality. All right. To get to your question, Steve Ricard, wasn't he a promoter in Australia? I believe so. I could be wrong about that. I haven't heard his name in decades, so I could be wrong. And who was the third person that was on the board? Oh, Sakaguchi.
Yes.
Okay.
New Zealand and Australia. He was, Rickard was born in New Zealand and then died in Australia. So
okay,
you had it right.
Wow, Prevagen shit works, dude. Oh my God, pull a name out of a hat from 30 years ago and tell you what territory he's from. Huh? Getting good at this shit. I've obviously never had any interaction with Ricard or Sakaguchi other than hello, how are you? I would assume all of those three gentlemen had probably a Bill Watts philosophy. And as such, I would imagine that you're right. It was more familiarity with Ric Flair. Ric Flair represented what in their minds I'm suggesting is, you know, kind of the way wrestling used to be and still should be. Whereas Rick Roode was bringing that WWE Hollywood, if you want to call it that, but the Vince McMahon vibe to it, you know, all show, no go, that kind of thing, which was what guys like Bill Watts thought of WWE and Vern Gagne. I mean, everybody was banking on the fact that the audience would get tired of the glitz and the glamour and want to go back to what wrestling used to be. That was the Bill Watts philosophy. So let's assume that Bill Watts, or they either all agreed with him or had enough influence to convince them, or whatever he would do under the table. Who knows? With Sakaguchi, anything would have been possible. But I would imagine that was a Bill Watts primarily a decision to kind of make sure we maintain the heritage and the integrity of the NWA with Ric Flair, as opposed to the showbiz Hollywood, you know, gimmick of Rick Roode. Maybe, I don't know. Sounds plausible.
Well, we know what's next is the Ric Flair, Rick Roode angle. Let's sort of recap the main angle. It's a Flair for the gold segment. Roode is going to kiss Fifi. Fifi is going to slap him. Roode is going to start getting hot about it. And Flair's going to tell Roode that, hey, you're not her type. And Flair turned his back on Roode. Roode grabs the NWA title belt and knocks out Flair, gives him a rude awakening, and leaves him laying. And then he starts doing interviews saying, out with the old, in with the bold. And this is supposed to be the final set of Flair for the gold segments, because now, of course, Flair's up and running and he can wrestle. But what's going to hang with Flair in more ways than one is Fifi, the French maid. She's going to become a part of the presentation on camera and off camera. And the theory for a long time has been this angle is what started the quote unquote beef with Ric Flair and Rick Roode.
I can see that.
And some would say it's because Roode was forward with the real life Wendy, who at the time, I believe Wendy was married and working on maybe one day having a family. And of course, Rick
volunteered,
was married. But there's a lot of rumor and innuendo that maybe they were more than just an on-screen duo. And I don't know that everyone knew that, but certainly Rick Roode maybe was taking his shot here. And then you couple with that with, hey, this guy's gunning for my belt and maybe my companion, whatever you want to say there. And then he's doing promos, out with the old, in with the bold. I could see how Rick would get hot about
that. Oh, the tangled webs we weave. But I can see all of that. And again, you're doing a great job explaining this, narrative, because I can picture it and kind of flash back to certain moments that I wouldn't have been able to. So yeah, that was it. And also, I've talked to Wendy. I mean, recently in the last couple of years, we've been to a number of conventions and signings and things together, and we've crossed paths a lot over the last couple of years. And it was within the last year or so, Wendy and I had a conversation about Rick and her work with Roode and her working with Roode. So yeah, that's all coming together right now. Yeah, I get it. That was it. It's no longer a rumor in innuendo. It is, at least in my opinion, a verifiable fact. We'll go with it.
When did you start to see any of that rear its head to you? That, hey man, Flair and Roode really don't like each other.
Not until within about 2 weeks of the story that I told you early on about going to Barry Windham.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't backstage a lot, I mean, I wasn't hanging out in the locker rooms. That just wasn't my thing. And so I didn't spend a lot of time with talent. That was back before Nitro. Nitro was a great opportunity for us, not to go off track, but we do the live event, and then because it replayed immediately thereafter, if you were the first 2, 3, 4 matches on Nitro, you were already at the bar watching it live most of the time before it ended. And then the rest of us would show up and we could all watch that show together. That was a great opportunity for us all to kind of be together and break down the show that we just got out of. Well, that didn't happen back, before Nitro. So guys like me, the talent would all leave. They'd go to their hotel or their strip club or whatever it is that they were going to do, or go on down the road for the next shot. Guys like me didn't do that. So I didn't hear a lot of the locker room chatter that would indicate that this thing was starting to, boil over until towards the very end. And it was like, holy shit, now what are we going to do?
I want to mention too, this is the era where we're trying to get ready for War Games, and there's going to be a mystery partner. We know it's going to be the former Typhoon. This is unfortunately the whole Shockmaster incident, but that's not the end of the whole mystery partner stuff. Dustin Rhodes is promising a mystery partner for Clash of the Champions. They're doing it at the Ocean Center in Daytona Beach. Now, I want you to remember, boys and girls, 3 years after this, Hulk Hogan is going to turn heel in the Ocean Center and change wrestling forever, creating the NWO. But here, we've got 8,903 fans. That's a strong crowd for WCW or the WWF in 1993. But only 2,400 of them were paying customers, which is just crazy, especially when we have now the benefit of hindsight of knowing what's possible with the NWO in this same company. On this particular Clash of the Champions, Dustin Rhodes' mystery partner to take on Rick Roode and the Equalizer, that's worth a Google, is Road Warrior Hawk. Meltzer would say the reuniting of the Road Warriors got a huge pop, but as soon as the match started, the Equalizer was so bad, it killed everything. That's the story of WCW in the early 90s. A lot of stops and starts. But the show got a 3.8 rating. It's viewed in 2.32 million homes. It's the largest audience to watch any pro wrestling TV show in the United States in 1993. And over the weekend, they're going to do a series of 2 out of 3 falls matches for the vacant U.S. title with Rick Roode and Dustin Rhodes. And then we start building towards, hey, what are they going to do with the NWA and Rick Roode? The write-up here in the Torch is the NWA promoters are going to attempt to get a deal where they'll allow Rick Roode to win the title since the TV has already been taped, but only if WCW agrees to have Flair regain the title from Roode at a house show promoted by a non-WCW but NWA affiliated promoter. And WCW sent word to the cable systems that the Flair Roode match is now advertised as a world heavyweight title match, not an NWA heavyweight title match. Of course, this is a lot of silliness here. In the scheme of things, I don't think it matters at all. WCW fans were watching to see these performers on this channel on that date. And it was probably a little confusing to the fans at home that we've got a WCW world title and we've got an NWA world title. We're not presenting ourselves as the NWA. We just have their belt. I could see how that would get confusing, Eric.
This is so stupid.
Yes.
And such a great example of how screwed up, mismanaged, and basically brain dead WCW management was at this time. This is what I inherited. This was so stupid. And what makes me really curious is who within WCW, who was in those meetings where they were trying to solve this issue that was hanging on to any excuse to even associate with the NWA. The fuck was it? It had no value. It had perceived value by some of the people that were in WCW, obviously, management, decision makers at some level. Otherwise, the conversation wouldn't be happening. I mean, it would, for me, faced with that situation, the very first time someone said, well, look, if you're going to do that, this is what we want, it would have been fuck you, bye.
Yeah.
Because there's no value in it other than what you've convinced yourself of, in your booking committee or whatever. So man, how stupid, how utterly stupid.
Dustin Rhodes winds up winning the U.S. title in the final match of the best of 3 series at Center Stage on August 30th. The match is going to ultimately air on September 11th. We'll see a referee bump. Rhodes will hit the Bulldog, but now there's no referee to count the fall. So as Rhodes is helping the referee, Rick Roode grabs a chair. Ric Flair, who was doing color commentary, runs in and grabs the chair. Flair and Roode are arguing here, so Dustin schoolboys Roode and wins the title. So now there's even more venom from Rick Roode to point towards Ric Flair. You cost me the belt. And it does put, let's appreciate the context here. I understand that these wrestling fans grew up with Ric Flair and they're going to cheer Ric Flair. But Ric Flair is like the ultimate bad guy. But it takes an even more hated heel to make Ric Flair the super babyface. And buddy, Rick Roode was that, was he not?
He was. He definitely was. And, before the triangle that pretty much killed the chemistry between those two, think about what could have been, had there not been that challenge in the middle, so to speak.
That's the NWA stuff continues to spiral out of control. There's a lot of frustration about what's going to happen, what's not going to happen. The biggest concern going into the convention and coming out is, of course, the status of the NWA heavyweight title held by Ric Flair, but scheduled to be switched to Rick Roode on September 19th. And there's a lot of folks who are against this. And it seems like the idea is we'll do it, but you got to owe us a favor. And eventually it's made clear by WCW when they sent a fax to cable operators to not bill the match as an NWA title match, but instead call it a world heavyweight title match. That WCW is just going to wash their hands of this whole NWA name. And there's a ton of legalities going back and forth because there's debate about when should we and when shouldn't we call it the NWA title. It's a total mess, but they even removed the mentions of the NWA on promos. They have Flair cut a series of promos and he never says NWA. And there's a worry, hey, what if they try to get some sort of injunction to stop the match or stop the pay-per-view? It's just all silliness. And in the end, as a result, when Roode does win it, technically we don't call it a world title anymore. It's now this, not really the NWA belt, not really the WCW belt. It's just the big gold belt, which I guess is another weird piece of history for that title in particular. But I'm with you. I would have told the NWA to go kick rocks.
On the very first conversation,
Yeah.
the fact that this was such a protracted deliberation over the period of weeks and I guess months, I mean, that's what shocks me. I can understand somebody going, hey, what if, we do the NWA, WCW thing, join. Okay. There's a little bit of value in that. There is the heritage, despite its recent history at the time of the NWA belt, bringing it back, keeping it on Rick Flair. So I understand that. I'm not saying that was a stupid idea. I can understand that. But the minute it became a problem, and the minute I had somebody that's outside of my company telling me what I can and can't do on the inside of my company, especially an entity that has no value, it isn't worth anything. It's a non-operational entity that's trying to protect a trademark that has no application. Fuck it. I'd give that 5 minutes. I'd listen for 3.5 or 4. And then within a minute or a minute 30, I would say goodbye. Stupid.
Meltzer would say, as of press time, the NWA had scheduled a hearing to attempt to get a preliminary restraining order on September 15th to ask that the Flair Roode match not be referred to as for any kind of championship on the pay-per-view. Any television references for it being for any kind of championship that were pre-taped be erased from future broadcasts. The idea being here, they're actually arguing, hey, even if you're not calling it the NWA world title, it still looks like that because that's the same belt and fans would be confused by that. So you can't call it the championship of any sort. In fact, you can't have that belt there at all. And we need it back. And we're going to put it on these other guys or what have you. So WCW ain't having that and says, nope, good luck. We're moving on. And we're moving on to the big pay-per-view, which is going to be Fall Brawl 1993. But the real battle happened in the courthouse a few days earlier. WCW is going to withdraw their membership of the NWA. It's a big mess. A lot of he said, she said, a lot of finger pointing. And the Torch would say, this all appears to be an inside job between Watts and Sakaguchi. Says NWA board.
I said that a little earlier, right? Mr. Keller was very prescient, very aware, understood the politics. That's funny. And it's probably true. Good job, Wade.
Internally, people started within WCW started to refer to this title as the Ric Flair belt. One of the NWA board members says he's confident that the letter will be found invalid. That's not like they're going to stop. WCW spokesman, who you and I are both friendly with, Mr. Mike Weber, told the Torch that WCW did not plan to use the name NWA at any point in the future. Quote, as of September 1st, WCW stopped all references to the NWA name, and that policy still stands. Unfortunately, it stood through maybe the worst show of 1993. At least that's according to Dave Meltzer. He would say the matches at Fall Brawl were sluggish. The booking was unimaginative. The matchmaking itself was downright pathetic. He said it looked pathetic on paper going in, and the result was even worse. And listen, I understand sometimes you like to dunk on Dave and say this or that, and I understand. But the show itself, goodness gracious, let's run through it. Lord Steven Regal against Ricky Steamboat for the TV title. Charlie Norris versus Big Sky on pay-per-view.
Ooh, doggy.
Too Cold Scorpio is going to team with Marcus Bagwell to take on Paul Orndorff, and the Equalizer. Ice Train is going to have a singles match on pay-per-view here against Shanghai Pierce.
Damn.
And we've got the Nasty Boys, Brian Knobbs and Jerry Sachs, taking on the Four Horsemen. Don't get too excited. It's Arn Anderson and Paul Roma. Then we've got Cactus Jack, who we know is one of the more talented performers we've ever seen, taking on Yoshi Kwan.
Oh my goodness
Rick Roode and
gracious.
Ric Flair for whatever that belt is called. And then in the main event, Sting, Davey Boy Smith, Dustin Rhodes, and the Shockmaster take on Sid, Vader, and Harlem Heat. I got to give it to Dave. On paper, this does not look good. And if you're struggling with sleep, we've got great sponsors to help you with that. But just turning on Fall Brawl 93 might do the trick.
Oh, I feel so bad. That was horrible. That was horrible. So as you're laying that card out, and I'm starting to visualize that. I wonder what was going on in Dusty's head. And I'm not saying that in a smart ass kind of way, but I know what it's like to be responsible for something that you're not in control of.
Yeah.
I know that feeling very, very well. And it's a horrible position to be in, right? To be held responsible for something you have absolutely no control of. Avoid those situations whenever you can, those of you who are listening.
Yeah.
Dusty was in that role. Dusty was in that position of being responsible for something not quite had no control of. But when it comes to creative, if you don't have the ability to sit down, not that you wouldn't collaborate and have people help you, but if you can't make a decision on a direction that you want to go for more than a week at a time, for the next month or 2 months or 3 months or whatever your creative cycle may be, if you don't have the ability to start it and end it the way you want to end it with help and support, you're in a position of being responsible without having control. And that's where Dusty was, because Dusty, we all know, had the ability, if properly motivated, and this is the fucked up thing about creative people, they don't work in a factory for a reason. They don't design houses and commercial buildings for a reason. They're not lawyers for a reason. They're creative people. And that applies, I think, to music and actors and actresses and oil painting artists, whoever. If you're an artistic person, you need to be kind of left to your abilities over a long term to see if you're any good at it.
Yeah.
Dusty was in that spot with Bill Watts. So I'm not making excuses, but I'm pointing out, 20 minutes ago, we were talking about the fantastic setup and the story that was being set up with Rick Roode and Ric Flair in the very beginning. And now it's deteriorated in a matter of months or less to this card. What the fuck happened in there? How could this guy that did such a great job of putting together the chessboard, right, laying out the chess pieces, a mere weeks later end up putting together a card that looked like it came out of a hat? It's weird. That's what I want to know. How'd that happen? And why? Why did that happen?
The crowd here is the largest crowd WCW's ever drawn in Houston. 4,500 fans. It's a 6,000 seat arena. But the real thing we're talking about today is a 2 3/4 star match. It goes 30 minutes and 47 seconds. Ric Flair is going to drop the world heavyweight title to Rick Roode. Meltzer would write this. Flair came out with Fifi, whose real name is Wendy Barlow. The funniest Fifi story came a few days before the match, where they were doing satellite transmission to hype the card, with Flair being interviewed by several television sportscasters from around the country. The satellite was already on with Flair and Fifi, and Fifi, who's never been put in this position before, asked Rick what happens if someone asks her something in French or wants her to talk in French. Anyway, Rick pretty much said he'd cover for her. It was never a factor, but in the second interview, Rick did the entire interview talking about what Rick Roode had done to Wendy. Roode is nowhere near the wrestler he was in the first half of 1992. The disc injury from last year is either much worse than anyone is letting on, because Roode used to be a bump machine and now he hardly bumps at all, or Roode simply doesn't care about having good matches anymore. Given that Roode doesn't bump and he's a heel, and that nearly every match he's had on a big show of any length over the last year has been awful, even with the legendary guy who can carry anyone, who decided to let this go 31 minutes? The first half of this match was terrible. Flair had never been in a match this bad on pay-per-view except for the one match with Sting where he played the Black Scorpion. The match picked up and ended up with all of its drawbacks still easily being the best match on the show, but that's only faint praise. The last 9 minutes were good, but not great, but the damage had already been done. Roode went for a pin, and after a fist drop, but Flair kicked out. Roode then went after Fifi. Fifi slapped him. Roode then started kissing Fifi, and as she struggled, Flair came back and went wild, putting Roode in the figure four. With the referee attending to Fifi, Rick pulled out a gimmick, hit Flair with it, and got the pin. 2 3/4 stars. Do you think this era, I mean, Flair had this reputation for a long time, for years prior to this, that he felt a longer match meant a better match? Do you think Flair would have been the advocate here for a long match, not Rick Roode?
I don't know. I mean, given the circumstances leading up to this, my inclination, if I had to place a bet, would be Rick would have preferred it to be shorter than longer. But creatively, you know, take the personal nonsense aside. I could see it because Rick was that guy. You know, Rick was ascending in his career and arguably in some ways, perhaps at the peak of it in terms of what he was doing in the ring and all that. The attention he was getting when he was at the peak prior to WCW or WWE. So I could see Rick kind of leaning into that, wanting a longer match, if it weren't for the issues.
Right.
The issues, I would say he'd probably want to just get it over with.
The WCW Saturday Night Show on 9/11, which would be Rick Roode and Dustin Rhodes' third match, did a 2.5 rating. So 2 of the 3 Rick Roode, Dustin matches did really good numbers. And it feels like it's Rick Rude's time. All the house show main events are Ric Flair versus Rick Roode. They never announce one way or another what the title is. Flair would routinely get the clean win, and fans thought the title had changed, but there was no announcement made about that and no presentation. And a lot of people would leave unhappy. But I guess they probably were like, hey, we don't want to get ourselves sued. We need to let some of this stuff die down. But one of the reasons that people were critical, or one of the things people said after being critical of Rick Rude's performance at the pay-per-view, is that he had just been on a promotional tour in Germany. So he had jet lag. He was not well rested. He was probably dragging. But the back injury, that's a real thing. And I don't know that everybody talked about it enough. I mean, this is very much a different area in wrestling where you don't want to lose your spot. If you've got any sort of upward momentum, and make no mistake, even if he wasn't the WCW world champion, Ric Flair was the top guy in 1993 in WCW. If you have an opportunity to work with him, sort of the equivalent of Hulk Hogan on this station, you don't take time off. I mean, not if you can help it. And Rick Rude, probably being old school, he's trying to gut through it and still jumping at these opportunities to go do promotional tours in Germany. That's good for him. That's good for his brand. You don't get asked to do that if you're the curtain jerker. You get asked to do that if you're a featured player. I think the back injury here had to be real, right?
I think the back injury was real. I think the back injury definitely affected what Rick could do in the ring. Rick didn't want people to know that. He didn't sell it. Rick and I talked Rude. I'm going to refer to Rick Roode as Rude to avoid confusion.
Sure.
But Rude and I talked occasionally about his issues. He no-sold it. Yeah, back's a little stiff. No big deal. Doc says things are going to be great. He didn't want to let it on. That's old school. You know, that's a guy that's used to working for his money, right? But now what we know, I think the back injury and the medication that Mr. Roode was prescribed to treat that issue, I think that was the beginning of ultimately the end. Unfortunately for Rick Roode, drugs started to play a factor. Rick Roode had amazing work ethic. Rick Roode could be difficult to work with creatively if things escalated, got a little hot in the conversation, because at his core, Rick was a fighter. I mean, I said when we opened up the show, I knew of him, fresh out of high school, because he and a bunch of other people that, ended up in the wrestling business, Wayne Bloom, the Road Warriors, both of them. Those guys they all came from they were all working as bouncers in bars. They were really, really, really well suited at that job. And the places they bounced in Northeast Minneapolis were historically, not the place you want to go if you want to, come home with the teeth in your mouth, if you want to cause trouble, if you want to be a tough guy. Those guys were notorious in the area that I lived. So that part of Rick Roode would come out if it was an intense creative conversation. We never threatened, even with me, and I know we're building up to something later on, but even when things got really hot, I was never afraid, not because I wouldn't have lasted 15 seconds with Rick Roode. It would have been more akin to child abuse than a fist fight. But I also wasn't afraid of him, even in that situation, because that's just, Rick, he just got intense, but I never was concerned about getting destroyed by Rick Roode, because I knew eventually he'd calm down and we could work to a solution. But he could be tough, no doubt about it.
Tony Schiavone is going to get on the WCW hotline and say that the title that Rick Roode now holds will no longer be recognized as a world title, and that Flair and Roode will simply wrestle for the physical belt with two referees, and the only world champion in WCW is Vader, which I guess everybody assumes in the Observer is going to eliminate a unification match. And Dave would say the decision comes on the heels of a television show where Flair and Roode, both in interviews, proclaim the title that apparently isn't going to exist in a few weeks as undisputed and the only world title in the entire sport. Their match was being pushed on TV as being the first time in history that a world title match will be rematched on the very next pay-per-view. Let's talk about a promo that happened here that got a lot of people talking. It's September 29th. They're in Atlanta. They're at Center Stage, and they're taping the Saturday shows for October 9th and October 16th. On October 16th, 1993, go find this promo. Roode comes out with the belt, and he's talking about his match with Flair at the pay-per-view. Of course, we're building towards Halloween Havoc. And he says, the question is, quote, will Fifi go with Flair or come with me?
Oh,
which probably qualifies as one of the better double entendres of recent memory. But again, yes, remember, behind the scenes, according to the rumor and innuendo, in real life, Rick Roode is in hot pursuit of the real life Wendy. And in real life, even though both she and Rick are married, I believe a lot of people were assuming that Rick was spending a little quality time with Wendy in this era. So here's two top guys battling over a belt, but in reality, they're really interested in the same lady.
This is like classic Greek literature. This is a love story.
Feels like a movie.
This is Romeo and fucking Juliet.
Yes.
Come on now. Classic Greek mythology and Shakespeare and the you talk about stakes and storytelling. And because Wendy and Ric Flair are both friends, I'm going to refrain from having as much fun with this analogy.
Well, I was going to say, you said Romeo and Juliet, and I'm thinking, I've read that before, and I don't reckon they were both married to other people. But still.
No, but it's a version. Everything evolves. Remember, I've said this a million times. There's only 7 basic stories known to mankind since the beginning of time, when fucking men were sitting around a campfire inside of a cave, drawing pictures of the hunt
yes,
that they were enjoying. right? There's 7 basic stories, and the love triangle is one of them. Now it's a little different with Romeo and Juliet, but it's the Ric Flair, Rick Roode, Wendy Barlow story is a derivative of the original Romeo and Juliet story.
Yeah.
Hey, can I take a break, Conrad?
Sure.
All right. And I'll remind you to hit record when we come back.
So let's talk about the October 9th edition of WCW Saturday Night. We're on our way to Halloween Havoc. Rick Roode is got the belt with him, and he's saying it's the big gold belt. That's what we're calling it now, the big gold belt. And he said he still believes the belt has tremendous heritage and value. It's kind of a bad spot for a talent to be in here, Eric, where, you know, this belt is no longer the NWA world title, and we can't even call it a world title. It's just sort of here, but it's the same belt that Dusty Rhodes and Ricky Steamboat and Ric Flair and Sting and so many guys have been made because of this world title. And now we can't really call it what it is or what it was. It had to be a little disappointing for Rick Roode as a talent, but also an unenviable position of, we got this big pay-per-view match I got to sell, and you're, you know, notorious, Eric, for saying stakes, got to have stakes. What are the stakes here with this belt that nobody seems to want or even know what the hell to call?
Goes right back to how stupid this idea was from the beginning.
Yeah.
There is no stakes because the belt really didn't mean anything.
Yeah.
It meant something, and the heritage meant something. Don't get me wrong. In terms of it being stakes, sure, people like, I mean, as you're describing, you know, what that belt represents, to me, it helps me better understand why people collect belts. It's not so much the belt, it's the stories and the characters and the moments that it was a part of.
Yes.
That, you know, you get your value from and are proud of. And I understand that. But in terms of driving story, the percentage of people that had that appreciation for the belt therefore would accept it as stakes was so minuscule. We're talking maybe dozens in the television audience. Maybe 50 people actually thought that that mattered enough to actually accept it as stakes. So you're right, man. It was a tough spot. You don't want to piss on it because now it's central to what you're doing. But you can't put it over either. It's kind of weird.
If you haven't already, go out of your way to find a picture or not, or maybe even watch. I could recommend watching it. The Halloween Havoc match, simply for Rick Roode's tights. You know, he made it a deal here for a long time where he would get his opponent. I mean, going back to the whole Jake the Snake Roberts thing in the WWF with Jake's wife, Cheryl, being on Roode's tights. Well, it's Halloween Havoc, and he's got on his right leg, Get My Tricks, and it's Ric Flair in a portrait with a black eye, or My Treats, and it's Wendy, aka Fifi, the French maid, on his left leg. Hilarious tights, great use of, you know, making part of your ensemble. I mean, everything about Rick Roode is heat here, and I just think it's good stuff, man. And he looked great with the big gold belt, whatever the hell it was, around his waist. The match itself, well, had a DQ finish. 19 minutes and 22 seconds. Meltzer would write, the match had 2 referees, one of which was Terry Taylor, whose referee stint was supposed to equate his babyface turn, although I don't think most people, quote unquote, got it. Earlier in the show, Taylor did an interview pretty much saying he's changing his ways. Earlier in the show, on an announcement, it was said that the international promoters of WCW recognize Roode's title as a world heavyweight title. So now it's a world title again. Whew. Meltzer would say this must make the fans at home think this company lacks any long-term thought process. Not to mention how this rescinding a title's validation and then giving it back so easily makes all the titles in the promotion look bogus. This was a lot better than last month's match. Very good with Flair doing very little of his normal routine, but with the worst finish thus far in the show. Flair started fast and got the figure 4 on in the first 2 minutes, but Roode made the ropes. Flair continued to work over the leg until Roode ripped him to the floor. Roode continued selling and for long periods of time, it made the earlier damage seem very realistic. After a double bump over the top, Flair came off the top rope to the floor with a punch/clothesline. Flair tried it a second time, but Roode caught him with the punch and took control. Once in the ring, Roode came off the top, but his knee buckled and he sold it, but still maintained the advantage using his patented several-minute camel clutch. Flair made a comeback, hit the Roode Awakening in 1650 for a near fall. Who doesn't like that when you use the other guy's finish? Flair came off the top, but Roode got his feet in Flair's face. Flair comes back with chops. Then we had 2 referee bumps. Roode pulls out an object, but Flair suplexes him. Object goes flying. There's a TBS still photographer at ringside, not realizing what was going on, and grabbed the object, which ostensibly ruined an already bad finish. The photographer then had to give the object back to Flair so he could use it. And then he got caught by referee Randy Anderson for the DQ. After the match, Roode tried to kidnap Fifi, but Flair tackled him on the ramp and went for the figure 4, but it was broken up by officials, 3.25 stars. So for years and years, we wrestling fans thought, hey, Starrcade's the big Mac Daddy of them all. You, as the guy who ran WCW during their greatest heights, said, no, it was really Halloween Havoc. This felt like a big time match, but it would also be, I would think you would come to the assumption, well, this is going to be the blow off, but it's not. They go with the DQ finish, but then still keep the heat on afterwards with the physicality and the whole Fifi stuff after the bell. What'd you think? Halloween Havoc 94 or 93 rather, Rick Roode and Ric Flair.
I liked it. You know, I haven't gone back and looked at it prior to the show, but your analysis of it or your description of it makes me want to. And I probably will before the day's over.
I would have liked to have seen a clean finish. Like, I know that's silly, but
here's
it
what I
feels
was
like a
thinking.
blow off.
You were kind of laying this out. Remember what I said a little while ago about, you know, Dusty Rhodes being in a tough spot and being responsible for, but not being in control of a situation. I think, and I'm not making excuses for Dusty, but I thought a lot about this today in some of this narrative. Dusty got a lot of heat. In fact, Meltzer called them dusty finishes.
Yeah.
Okay. Dusty's approach to story sometimes led to a lot of DQs and unsatisfying in the moment endings of matches and endings of stories, and rather tried to find ways to continue them. I think the idea of finding a way to continuing the arc of the story is a great idea, but you do have to be careful how you pick and choose extending that story. And at the same time, the audience was conditioned to a certain TV, pay-per-view, TV, pay-per-view. So they have been conditioned to that. When you see a pay-per-view, you're expecting a blow-off, as it should, because it's a pay-per-view. It should be the ending of most stories, but not all. Some stories could continue. Some stories could launch out of a pay-per-view, for example. But Dusty was experimenting, and Dusty had to serve another master, you know. And I'm not sure where Dusty was as a booker during this particular time, because there were some big changes along the way around this time, and they happened in rapid succession. But if Dusty's, and I'm pretty sure Dusty's booked this, but if Dusty was booking this, he's trying to do what he wants to do and the vision that he sees, but he has to compromise that in many respects with what, if my timing is right on this, Bill Watts wanted. And that's what I meant by, you're responsible, but you're not in control. And that's where you make, you know, decisions like that and compromises like that.
I want to mention something that was written in the newsletter that really jumped off the page to me. It's from The Torch. WCW planned the finishes of many of Halloween Havoc's matches with the philosophy of just trying to get out of the match without damaging either wrestler, arguably not realizing that to protect both wrestlers is to also seriously damage the company as a whole. Because I do feel like, as a pay-per-view, you know, let me qualify that again. If it's a television match, okay. If it's a house show match, Okay. But if it's a pay-per-view match, you know, like the psychology behind me as a wrestling fan, if I'm just watching TV, it doesn't cost anything. My investment is just some time and flipping the channels. I'm going to be watching something. I'm plopped down in front of the TV. So it's this or football or some old rerun movie or what have you. And if they're coming to town, okay, I'm going to take my kid to see the big stars and buy the t-shirts and get the cotton candy or whatever. But if I'm sitting at home, and in this era, you couldn't just press a button and buy a pay-per-view. You had to drive down to the cable place, get the little gimmick to put on the back of your TV. It was a bigger process. I had to be invested. I had to put forth effort. And then I had to write a check to the cable company for an extra $30. And I'm not getting the resolution that I hoped for. Man, he's finally going to get what's coming to him. And it doesn't happen. I understand if you have to do that sporadically to build to the next thing. But doesn't it become, Eric, eventually a fool me once, fool me twice type of deal where eventually I'm just going to say, nah, nothing ever happens. I'll just wait and see what happens on the Saturday TV for free.
That's where people that listen to me, whether it's on this podcast or in interviews that I do or on other people's podcasts, I keep getting a lot of the same questions over and over and over again. And my job is to try to answer them as best I can. But when we talk about what is missing in today's wrestling presentation across the board is a sophisticated story formula, architecture, format, whatever you want to call it. Because as it was in 1993, to a large degree, the same situation still exists. What we're talking about in 1993 is an example of not having long-term vision or storytelling in mind. And to a large, and I agree with what Dave said, which is what started you off on this topic about the damage that non-finishes, to paraphrase, can do in the long term to the company's product. I absolutely agree with that. The solution is not to, well, if we're going to build this up for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, whatever the buildup is, whatever the structure of that story is, so that you hit the appropriate points in that story at the appropriate times in order to keep the audience invested in that story. That's what a more sophisticated storytelling architecture formula, whatever you want to call it, should have looked like in 1993 and should still look like today. And it was lacking during both of those eras, or is in this case lacking today even, because the solution would be not to, well, let's not have a clean finish, because that's a disaster. That hurts the business, that hurts the audience's, your credibility with the audience and that relationship you have with them to convince them to part with $30 or $40 or $60 every month, right? They didn't have a formula in place that said, okay, let's really focus on this pay-per-view. We don't want to necessarily at this point in time put one talent over another talent. So here's what didn't happen in 1993. Let's focus on an amazing finish that is so good and so well set up. And we know what the arc points are going to be over the next month or 2 months or 3 months, however long you're going to extend that. So let's focus on that finish. Let's come up with the best reason, palatable, credible, emotional reason why the audience will continue watching the story post this pay-per-view. Instead of it was, what do you got? I don't know. What do you got? Well, we don't want to beat either one of these guys. What do you got? DQ. Count out. It was fast. It was a solution. Everybody knew it wasn't the best solution, but it was a compromise that everybody could get comfortable with. And they would convince themselves then and now that, oh, we'll figure out a way. We'll figure that out next week. We'll figure out a way to continue the story next week. Well, in this particular instance that we're talking about 1993, you didn't have the opportunity to do that because you disappointed the audience. You didn't even attempt to set up the next chapter in that story. That would have been done somewhere in the third act of that story. If you know you're going to have a first act of a new story or an extended story, then you have to set that up weeks, maybe even a month or two in advance. Then you'll come up with that idea. But instead it was, oh, this is a fucking DQ, count out, DQ, count out, DQ. That was the extent of that thought process when it came to coming up with a finish that is going to lead to a future story. It was razor thin. It was done kind of half-ass old school from a weekly booking territory, mentality and philosophy that was no longer working in the era of television. And that challenge still exists today.
I want to ask you about another story. This is from the Observer. Unfortunately, Dave had to write about the whole scissor fight with Sid Vicious and Arn Anderson. He wrote this: "It's well known the original plan was for Vicious to win the WCW title from Vader at the same card, then win the other world title from Rick Roode in early '93 to finally unify the belts and be pushed as the focal point of the company. We know that's not going to happen. Vicious is going to wind up out of WCW, so he's not going to be in the main event of Starrcade taking on Vader. Instead, it's going to be Ric Flair, and Flair and Vader steal the show. It's in Charlotte. It's a major moment in Flair's career, but it wasn't the original plan." But do you remember that being the original idea, that Vicious would unify both belts and become sort of the brand for WCW in 1994?
I don't remember it. Obviously there was a lot of discussion. Let's be real. What we just kept on talking about was lack of long-term planning and vision, right?
Yeah.
So I could we have been in a situation where, that was a topic of a conversation and people were leaning in that direction, and depending on what happened 2 hours ago, maybe they'll change their mind or not. Yeah. But I don't think there was any long-term plan for anything, by evidence of the television show and the pay-per-views. There was not a lot of long-term planning going on. This was a weekly booking mentality that existed in WCW at that time.
Let's talk about the next Clash of the Champions. Meltzer would say Rick Roode retained what is now called the WCW International World Title, going to a double count out with Road Warrior Hawk in 541. He says, if this is a world title, and that seems to change daily, then this may have been the world title match on a major show in history. Hawk was wrestling with a blown out knee and couldn't do anything, which is why that was the case. But the match had a horrible finish, no psychology, and no action. -2 stars. On the same show, we would see the Nasty Boys retain the tag titles against Davey Boy and Sting. But before the match, Roode would attack Davey Boy, give him the Rude Awakening on the ramp, and that begins their program. Now Sting has to work the match, really 2-on-1. Not really the best start to Rick Rude's reign. This sort of flat match with Hawk, it kind of is what it is. And almost immediately, Davey Boy's fired. And the Observer would say it's reportedly done to set an example about too many no-shows. And on the heels of that, Davey Boy has apparently already contacted Titan about coming back. And he's definitely contacted independent promoters saying, hey, I'm available for dates. And WCW does a major burial job of Davey Boy on TV that will probably air before you read this, according to Dave Meltzer. What do you remember about, boy, it feels like if it wasn't for bad luck, Rick Roode would have no luck at all with this title run. Specifically, we're going to start something with Davey, but can't really play it off.
Another day at the office. Notice the pattern here. Pattern recognition is an important part of getting through my day. And same pattern, no plan, no thought process. Just
the plan.
Every day you show up. I mean, and I'm not saying that a lack of planning was necessarily the problem here. Obviously, there were other issues with Davey, right?
Yeah.
We all know what they are. No need to beat him up. He's not here to defend himself. So we're going to leave that part alone. But the decision was made to get rid of Davey because of things that had been happening, over a period of recent weeks. That shit happens. Even if you would have had a great plan, that likely would have happened. But I'll also say that that type of a problem, not necessarily for those exact reasons, but that type of week to week to week, you never know what shit's going to hit the fan. Start getting used to it after a while. It's like you become nose blind to it. You know what I mean? You see it so often that it no longer registers. And I think nose blind is a great way to say, you know how when you walk into somebody's house and maybe they cooked lasagna the night before and you walk in, you haven't smelled that smell in a while, you walked in, bam, you go, wow, somebody made some great lasagna last night. And to the people who cooked the lasagna last night and enjoyed it, they don't smell a thing.
They don't notice it at all.
No, it's like, you know, when people think their shit don't stink.
Yeah.
You ever have a friend? Now you like this friend. You get along, you have fun together, but the guy thinks his shit doesn't stink. You overlook it. You try, because it's not necessarily an endearing quality. And I've got one of those friends, but he thinks his shit literally doesn't stink. Like, unbelievably so.
How is Bruce doing? I haven't talked to him.
No, it's not about Bruce. I've got a friend of mine in town by the name of Mike. He and his wife come over a couple times a year, usually not over a holiday, but in a day adjacent to a holiday weekend. They'll come over and we'll cook. And we used to love having them over, but every time Mike came over, you know, he'd use the restroom and he'd stink up the whole fucking house.
Oh, wait, you meant literally shit don't stink.
No, I mean literally shit don't stink. He thinks his shit doesn't stink. Literally thinks his shit doesn't stink.
Wow.
And I don't know if he's got some kind of a digestive problem or what the fuck. Like if he eats garbage, you know, all day long. But motherfucker, in the summertime, it's okay. Because you got windows, you know, you can walk outside with your cocktail or, you know, finish your brisket out on the porch because the house stinks so bad every time you use the bathroom. And the other thing I used to think about, Mike, is, Mikey, you know you're going to dump. Why don't you dump before you leave? Dump in your own house.
Yeah.
Maybe you're nose blind to this nonsense, but the rest of us aren't. And I found something for Mike. In fact, I want to give a shout out to Donna Seaman. Donna Seaman used to work with us in WCW, PR marketing, I'm pretty sure. She's a fun chick. She, in fact, her and Miss Elizabeth and Janie Engel and my wife, you know, Mrs. B, because it was our house, would come out here and go trout fishing and go hiking and tear the town up for a night or two. And Donna Seaman was there among us. But Donna and her sister came up with a product for my friend Mike. Not specifically, but they have this product. It's called the Wabi Whiffs tooth spray. You know, when you walk out of the bathroom and it's not like fucking horrible, it's not a medical emergency, right? You don't have to call in a hazmat team like Mike should, but you know, you just want to, you know, you're in somebody else's house, give it a little sprint. Or if you have people coming over, they don't want to feel like they're stinking. Except for Mike, he doesn't give two shits. Literally doesn't give two shits. He gives 3 or 4. It's disgusting, but just a little touch up. Then he got these really cool things. Sprinkle and go toilet bombs. I'm not kidding you. They smell wonderful, clean and fresh, kind of like the ocean. You know what I mean? You just drop a couple of these bad boys in there, they fizz up, and it's actually a really pretty shade of blue. And it takes about 30 seconds. You take care of your business, you flush, you walk out, and nobody knows the difference. And the best part, here's my favorite one, and I promise I'll get out of these. These are called on-the-go singles. This is the thing, like Dave Silva, you know, some of the people we both hang out with need to have some of this stuff, right? These things, it's just a little package, put them in your wallet, put them in your back pocket, whatever. And if, again, you're someone else's house, it's the holidays, you don't want to embarrass yourself, take a couple of these with you, sprinkle them in there, let them dissolve for a minute, take care of your shit, literally, and you're good to go. And somebody else can follow right behind you and not even know you were in there taking care of business. Wabi Whiffs. Go to wabiwhiffs.com. wabiwhiffs.com/83 weeks. You're going to save a ton of money. 20% off your entire order. Anything over $50 is free shipping. Go to wabiwhiffs.com. Check it out and give it to your friend who thinks his or her shit doesn't stink. Sorry, just had to squeeze that in.
You know, buddy, we were about 4 minutes into that before it even crossed my mind this might be a commercial. We have got to get a hold of Mike. I mean, does Mike listen to the show? Are you telling him, is he going to find out from listening to this?
Oh, no, well, that's why I didn't give his last name. Now, he's not a huge wrestling fan.
There's 12 people who live in your town. There can't be that many fucking Mikes.
Yeah.
Come over.
Yeah, but the question is, will Mike be exposed to the podcast or any of the social media that I'm sure is going to follow? I don't know, because I don't think he follows wrestling that closely. That's not why we're friends.
Just so you know, if I ever get invited to Cody and we wind up hanging out in your favorite watering hole and Mike wanders in, when you go to the bathroom, Mike and I are going to have a conversation.
No, I literally took this off our bathroom sink, our guest bathroom sink. So we got it all here. Whatever you need. Wabi Whiffs, WABIWHIFFS.com/83 weeks. And it's also a cool way to tell people, hey, dude, your shit actually does stink, so quit thinking it doesn't.
I don't know. This is a masterful job what you've done here. Let's talk about Davey Boy a little bit more here. He's supposed to be allegedly challenging Rick Roode at Starrcade. But they're going to do a taping on December 13th at Center Stage where they play his music for a match with Roode, but he's not there. So it's like, hey, he's a chicken who no-showed a contracted match. And it's
kind of like Vince McMahon, but whatever, go on.
At that point, the boss, former big boss man, would show up and promptly defeat Roode in a non-title match to set up a pay-per-view match between the two. So let's remind everybody, the big boss man is fresh off WWF TV. And a lot of people, as that character, assume he's going to be able to use a similar character here in WCW. That is not the case. He had a less than awesome run, but people are already speculating he'll be back in the WWF in early 94. In fact, he had even worked shows in California right before popping up here. This is a surprise here, this WCW taping having the boss man. Do you remember Ray Traylor coming in here, and had you seen any of his work as the big boss man? Was this exciting to you, or just another day at the office that he's showing up in WCW?
I mean, certainly I was aware of Big Boss Man and WWF. Again, when I say I didn't watch on a regular basis, I didn't put it on my calendar. I didn't plan my week around it. Oh, I got to watch it because I need to know what's going on with it. It was none of that shit. If on a Monday, night prior to Nitro, obviously, I got home in time and was able to have dinner, and there was nothing else going on, sure, I'd sit down and watch at least some of Monday Night Raw. So I was aware of him, but it wasn't like I was following him. And I had never met Ray Traylor before coming to WCW. Immediately, we got along great. It's just, even though we had never met before, it was an authentic, genuine kind of, we enjoyed being around each other, sense of humor, that kind of stuff. He was a fun guy to be around. Ray was a hoot. Ended up taking, Ray took my son and I deer hunting. Actually, Garrett got his very first deer with Ray Traylor and Rick Steiner. So, yeah, I dug Ray, but it wasn't because I was so familiar with his WWF work. I was just aware of it.
According to the newsletters, the Observer at the time, Roddy Piper was originally talked about for this Davey Boy replacement, but it winds up being Boss Man. And the Torch would say Jesse Ventura was flown into Atlanta this past week just to dub commentary over one match, Boss Man versus Roode, and then was sent home. He may not do Starrcade because he's been used for all of his 50 scheduled dates that his contract allows. And the Observer would say that Smith negotiated some sort of deal with Bill Watts for a certain amount of money per match, which was supposedly $1,000. And he was under the impression that on dates he wasn't working for WCW, he was free to work independent shows. which is consistent with what Watts had said about the contracts that he was signing up people with during that time period. He also agreed to let him go tour Japan since he already had a deal with Giant Baba before he negotiated.
Sounds to me like he was the originator of the open door policy or forbidden door policy or whatever it's called, right?
Maybe a little bit.
Come on now.
Anyway, the concept is the European tour is where Davey Boy received the same payday, which would have been late October, early November. He had complained about the money, and it wound up with him saying he's not going to the house shows unless he got what he felt he was due for the European tour. Apparently nobody at WCW contacted him to sort all this out. And so on November 30th, he taped the angle where he beat Rick Roode to set up their planned match at Starrcade. He then missed the TV taping in Dalton and then quit unless the European money was made good. So WCW then fired him, citing the missed show. So I kind of agree with Davey here as Wade lays it out. Hey man, $1,000 in the States kind of is what it is, but in Europe, I'm worth a lot more and I should be paid commensurate to that, not the same $1,000. And I guess that's a wrap. So let's talk about Starrcade. Rick Roode retains the WCW International World Title, whatever we're calling the big gold belt today, pinning the Boss, aka Ray Traylor, aka Big Bubba, aka the Big Boss Man, in 9 minutes and 8 seconds. Meltzer would say Boss Man crotched himself on the ropes and Roode pinned him with a sunset flip. It was not nearly as good as their television match, but Roode got a good hit reaction coming out. So some people haven't caught on. They should not even worry about unification. They should just make this belt disappear. 2 stars. What do you think about that? The idea that on some level, when it's not working, just scrap it.
I think a lot has to do with how much time and effort has been invested in trying to make it work. I think if you've done everything that you can do and you've looked at as many different creative options as possible and you come to the conclusion this shit isn't going to work, then absolutely. Sometimes you just got to pull the plug. Hit delete, start over, fresh page. And eventually the audience, hopefully, will let it go. But as was probably the case here, not a lot of time and effort went into it. And I don't blame Davey Boy. The way you laid that story out, based on Wade Keller's reporting, good job, Wade. I'd have been right there with Davey. If you promise one thing and then given something else, and someone's trying to convince you that, no, it's just a date. It doesn't matter that we're in Europe, which is the reason you're here anyway, because we can't really build a European tour without you. That's kind of bullshit. It's unfortunate.
So in December, some more bad news for Rick Roode. He's going to be a part of a civil suit that was filed based on Randy Jordan, who was 32 at the time, and Johnny Small, who was 39 at the time, claiming they were assaulted the prior summer here at Coyote Joe's nightclub on Wilkinson Boulevard in Charlotte. Supposedly, Jordan and Small were in a nightclub around midnight on August 13th, when, according to the lawsuit, Knobs and Roode were harassing a bar patron. Small stepped in and asked them to leave the guys alone. And according to the lawsuit, Roode and Knobs started beating the shit out of him. Quote, one of the nasty boys did me a belly-to-belly slam on the floor and then had his thumb in my eye trying to pull my eyeball out. The girlfriend said the only reason she knew I was under there, she seen a little piece of my shirt under the big guy. The lawsuit also accused Coyote Joe's management of ignoring employee warnings that an assault was about to take place. And the general manager of the bar said, we were not notified that there was any sort of lawsuit. Truth be known, it was a minor infraction. Small and Jordan are asking for $10,000 in actual and punitive damages. This isn't something you hear a lot about, but I'm sure it's something that guys had to deal with a lot if they wound up in a bar at midnight drinking and some civilians are involved. It feels like when they realize, wait a minute, these are TV stars, maybe I can get some money out of this deal. Let's say
I think it's a little bit. I mean, I've been in, fortunately, I've never been at the center of situations like that, but I've seen it play out. And I think you get any number of negative intersections. When you put wrestling talent, general public, alcohol, it's a perfect recipe. Depending on the talent in the bar, and the clientele of the bar, it's a perfect recipe for shit to go down. I've seen it. And I want to really be sure I'm clear about this. 98% of the time, 99% of the time, people that I'm around and in situations, even going back 20 years now, hotel bar after Nitro being the best one. Wrestling fans know you're going to be there. You can't avoid it. The bar's filled with wrestling fans, especially as we started getting hot. It was more like a hot Friday night in the club than a Monday night in the club. We were blowing away Monday Night Football in these particular, and a lot of the hotel bars were sports bars. So you couldn't avoid it. And there was alcohol. So you got wrestlers, you got civilians that are wrestling fans, and you got alcohol. 99% of the time, you never had an issue. Fans were very respectful. Sure, they wanted a little bit of your time. They wanted a picture if they could get one. But I've rarely ever seen situations where, I was concerned about a fight breaking out. But there have been some. And more often than not, it's not the civilian just happened to be in the wrong place in the wrong time. And as that complaint pointed out, this individual that got his ass kicked just kind of walked over to the bar and asked, Rick and Nobs, politely, hey, leave these guys alone. Okay, that sounds good on paper. I've seen more situations where civilians are trying to make their bones or get credibility, if you will, in their local bar by trying to start shit with a talent. I've seen it. I saw a guy do it to Big Show. Come on, people are stupid. Certain people get real stupid when they start drinking, and it's like they want to fuck her. They think it's fun. They've lost their sense of judgment, right? And they think it's just a big joke, or it'll be funny, or their friends will think that they're, whatever for fucking with their wrestling talent. And depending on who that wrestling talent is, you can get your head fucking caved in. I've seen that. Rarely seen wrestling fans, being obnoxious to wrestling talent, and disrespectful, but I've seen those situations where people, they stepped out of their lane. They weren't appropriate. They were egging it on. Like I said, I watched a guy egging on Paul White in a bar till he disappeared. Boom, God, where'd he go? Oh, he's down there. Silly. Why would you do that? Why would you do that to anybody, especially somebody that's, professional wrestler? Because the odds are they're a professional wrestler for a reason, not the least of which is at the very least they're tough as hell.
So from the Observer year-end awards, Rick Roode would win the most unimproved award. Sid Vicious is second, followed by Lex Luger, Mr. Perfect, and Ric Flair, whatever that means. New Japan announces that they've got a March tour that's going to happen from the 5th to the 24th. A lot of American talent on there, like Scott Norton, Hercules, Nasty Boys, but also Rick Roode. And Meltzer would say that in exchange, Great Muta is going to be in WCW in April. They're trying to reestablish some major talent swaps here. And Rick Roode carrying the WCW International Heavyweight Championship over is something that is pretty appealing to them. But the Torch would say, given how far his work rate has fallen over the last year, he thinks that's an interesting decision. But still, Japan sees him as a star. So here we are. Clash of the Champions on January 27th, which would be the television debut of Bobby the Brain Heenan and the final show of the Dusty Rhodes era. Meltzer would say, turned out to be just another show. It was thumbs down by a significant margin of the readers. The show drew 3,200 fans to the Centroplex in Baton Rouge. Only about half of those were paid. And we would see Ric Flair team with Sting here to take on Vader and Rick Roode. It's an elimination tag match that goes 22 minutes and 27 seconds. Rick Roode and Vader. Did a more badass team ever exist, dude?
I put all my money on Rick Roode on that one. But yeah, that two tough guys. I could, in as far as take real life out of it. It doesn't matter. It's silly, childish bullshit. But in the context of who'd win a fight between those two, that's like high school shit. But in terms of two guys that could just lay it into each other and enjoy doing it inside of the ring for television or pay-per-view, that was an awesome team.
But them on one side against Flair and Sting. I mean, we're firmly cementing Flair as a babyface when he's teaming with Sting. And man, you want to talk about the big bully of a heel that Vader was, given everything we saw with him and Flair at Starrcade, and now Rick Roode, who's been Sting's rival since the day he showed up. This is good stuff. Rick Roode has a lengthy chin lock like he did in a lot of matches in this era. He's going to do a reverse tombstone pile driver. Sting's going to do the Roode Awakening. And after reversing the tombstone, Sting is going to win with a splash off the top rope. 3 1/4 stars. And it's announced that Rick Roode and Sting are going to appear at a dome show on May 1st for New Japan. And before you know it, they start planning for the April pay-per-view, which is going to be Spring Stampede. And people are talking that it might be Flair versus Muta in the main event. And then maybe they start teasing, hey, it could be Flair and Roode both defending their respective titles. Of course, there are other plans. The Spring Stampede show was at least once upon a time advertised as Rick Roode versus Sting for the WCW International title. And the preliminary plan for the Slamboree show was going to have Roode defending his title against Vader in a heel versus heel match. And at least in the meantime, they're doing house shows that are really, frankly, poorly attended. 750 people in Sebring, Florida, and only 2,000 in Lakeland, Florida, to see Flair team with Sting and the Boss to take on Ron Simmons, Vader, and Rick Roode. Talk about disheartening. When you've got Flair and Sting and the former Big Boss Man and Ravishing Rick Roode and Vader and all these big stars, and 750 people are there, something's amiss.
Yeah, it was a lot of things. Part of it was for so long, even in 90, 91, 92, 93, WCW was so poor, and it was so poorly attended. We had such a difficult time of getting attendance at live events or even television or pay-per-views. Just nobody cared. And part of it was because in the year or 2 or 3, depending on where you were on this timeline, WCW started papering houses like fucking crazy. I mean, did not care. There was only one goal: get people in the arena, however you could do it, because the talent isn't drawing. Stories aren't drawing. So let's do whatever we have to do to get the bodies in the arena. So at least if we're going to produce this stuff for television, it looks good. Well, you start conditioning your market, your audience, your fans to realize that you never have to buy a ticket. You'll get them for free. Over time, what do you think happens to those markets? You can't sell a ticket. You've been giving this shit away for free now for years. Did I ever tell you my story about my first experience with a hooker?
No.
I met this hooker. I didn't know she was a hooker. Now, I'm like, how old was I at the time? Maybe 20. I was going to college, 19, 20, whatever. Going to college, St. Cloud State University, got a bunch of friends. Everybody says, hey, we could do this big charter to Vegas for like $99 round trip. And we stay at this hotel. It was like it was in the old Vegas part of town. I can't remember the name of it. But I mean, it was as low rent as you could possibly, but $99 round trip from Minneapolis. Who the fuck's not going to try to do that, right? So me and my buddies we left on a Thursday night and we started partying all the way there on this charter flight to Las Vegas. Anyway, I'll fast forward. I had no money at the time. That means zero. I might have had $75 or $100 in cash to my name. Probably had a credit card that had a $100 limit on it. So I wasn't like heavy with cash, but I went to Vegas anyway. I figured, what the fuck, I could afford the package. So I go to Las Vegas. The second, third last night, I'm there. And I had a similar thing happen to me at the Omni Hotel once too. But I'm sitting there at the bar. It's like 2:00 in the afternoon. We're supposed to leave like on a flight at 7. So I'm all packed out of my hotel room. Everything. And this really gorgeous girl, she was young. She was like me, 20, 25, 22, whatever. Sitting at the bar, and we strike up a conversation. And next thing I know, it's like we're up in my room. Now, at this point, I didn't know she was a hooker. At this point, I thought I was just smoking hot. I thought I need to move to Las Vegas. I'm this fucking chick magnet that's up in northern Minnesota in a small college when I could be here in Vegas pulling absolutely gorgeous women. What am I doing wrong? Who needs to go to college? So as I'm planning my move to Las Vegas, because all of a sudden I'm finding out who I really am in the eyes of hot women, I'm up in my room and she says, that'll be $100. $100 for what? Because it didn't dawn on me immediately. And then she tells me, she's a hooker. Well, that kind of blew the event for me. A, because I didn't have $100. Therein lies the real reason. But B, it's like, whoa. Now, if she'd had not hit me with a price tag, I would have been very excited about that and maybe revisited, come back to Las Vegas, look her up again. And, who knows, a relationship could have blossomed. But once you start giving it away, nobody's going to pay for it. And it's the same story. You give this shit away, and eventually it has no value and people don't come back. I stayed in Minnesota, right? I don't know why I went off on that tangent, but my point is you can't give tickets away every time you're in a market. Some markets we were in 3 times a year, 4 times a year, some more for television that were close.
In the future, if you ever want to get my attention, start with, hey, did I ever tell you about my first time?
I'm sorry if that was a letdown, by the way. I don't know that it helped prove my point or not. My point is, once you give this shit away, you can't charge anybody for it.
I just need to know what the payoff was. You said you didn't have $100. I assumed that you had already done the deed, and then you.
No, I didn't.
Okay,
I couldn't. I didn't have $100.
I thought it was.
I'm not sure I had $100 when I landed.
I'm just glad she didn't wind up in a trunk somewhere.
Nope.
Let's talk about Super Brawl, Albany, Georgia, Civic Center. 7,600 folks are there. There's 4,217 that paid, but the total gate's only 39,000. But believe it or not, it's written in the Observer, the group was pleased out of their mind with the turnout. And here's one of the things they did, because they thought they were going to have to block off most of the arena because ticket sales were not moving. But they did a gimmick where they gave away 4 free tickets to anyone who turned in a handgun. So we got 290 guns here.
Yeah. Oh my God. What's so perfect is that's coming, that piece of information, which I'm not even sure I ever was aware of it, is coming right off my, once you give it away, you can't charge for it conversation. God dang it. That was beautiful. That was
a handgun. Get you 4 tickets.
But as stupid as it sounds, because how stupid was that?
It was pretty bad.
I wouldn't be shocked if I hear some town somewhere doing the same thing.
Well, let me mention the show, even though we all agree was bad, did 99,000 buys, which they're acting like back then was just awful. A lot of companies running pay-per-views these days that do not do 99,000 buys. We've got Sting and Brian Pillman and Dustin Rhodes teaming up to take on Rick Roode, Steve Austin, and Paul Orndorff. I want to run through that one more time. Sting, Hall of Famer. Brian Pillman, Hall of Famer. Dustin Rhodes, Hall of Famer. Rick Roode, Hall of Famer. Steve Austin, biggest star in the history of the business. And Paul Orndorff, Hall of Famer. I don't care if they're in the Halls of Fames or not. Everybody understands.
Yep.
These are all big time Hall of Fame talent. And this is the first ever Thunder Cage match. And A lot of juice, a lot of action, 4.25 stars. Meltzer would say the highlight was Austin on the apron and Rhodes kneed him and he took the bump and pretty much crotched himself on the cage. After the match, Roode slammed the door on Sting's head and left him laying with the Roode Awakening to set up the next pay-per-view show. Of course, the baby faces are victorious, but still a lot of big time stars, a lot of super capable in-ring performers, a lot of talent. Even though we're saying this was an interesting time for WCW, that match was badass, dude.
Don't remember it. I'd have to go back and watch it to be fair. It sounds exciting as you laid it out. I'd be curious as to what the story was like leading up to it and the quality of it. But yeah, it sounds like it sounds like what a cage match should sound like if there was a good story leading up to it, because it's action that you don't normally see, and it sounds like it was done really, really well.
There's an interesting moment here where the Vicki Lawrence show has Sting, Rick Rude, Johnny B. Bad, Jesse Ventura, and Missy Hyatt on. This is right around the same time that the WWF and Vince McMahon had been indicted, and the whole steroid thing comes up. And Ventura says WCW has a testing a testing program, and Meltzer sort of makes fun of it. But Jesse doubles down on Vince McMahon's indictment. And then when they get around to Sting, he says something like, "There's nothing in my body except bran muffins." This is a bad spot for everyone to be in. And apparently only Rick Rude notices that, because as soon as Ventura gives his steroid answer, Rick Rude doesn't say another word the entire show. I don't know if that's for obvious reasons. And I say obvious, I wasn't there, but I think most people assume Rick Rude used steroids and he didn't think they were nearly the villain that the media was presenting them to be at the time. Or he knew, hey man, I just wrestled on a house show in front of 750 people and I'm planning on being a wrestler for a long time. I'm not going to say shit against Vince McMahon right now. Which do you think it was?
Probably a little bit of both. And what about Jesse Ventura? Has Jesse Ventura ever used steroids?
Of course he has. Come on.
Okay, so that could have been part of the factor too. Not only was Rick thinking about his future and the way to respond to something like that, he's also sitting next to a guy from North Minneapolis, by the way, which is where Jesse was from or lived for a long time, which is where Rick Rude was from, by the way. And knowing that Jesse was being hypocritical. Not only was he, of course, Jesse's Jesse. Jesse wanted his shot to lash out at Vince McMahon, and he took it. But at the same time, he was taking it to a lot of the guys in the business, or just the business, and was doing it despite the fact that Jesse was a part of it. That's pretty fucking hypocritical. I'm surprised all Rick did was sit there and take it. Rick, I know, was probably debating whether or not he wanted to blister and embarrass Ventura on television, but opted to just sit there and keep his tongue in his mouth. Professionally, the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But that's pretty bullshit, actually.
In the Torch, which is dated March 12th, they're covering things that happened the week of March 7th, or through then, which would include February 28th TV taping at Center Stage, where Okerlund would interview Sting, who's complaining about Rick Rude avoided giving him the title shot. But he says he has an ace in the hole. And on his way to the ring for a squash, two women who were plants jumped out of the crowd and tried to get to Rick Rude. Doug Dillinger starts to escort the women away, but Rude signals for one of them to be freed. She comes back, gets Rude's autograph and phone number. Then he kissed her and she fainted. And then Rude wins the squash, and then Sting interrupts the interview. He goes up to the women in the crowd, took the paper that Rude signed from her, and then Sting revealed that he put her there and it was a carbon sheet of paper. And what Rick Roode signed was actually a contract for the international title shot. Sting thanked Rick Roode for adding his phone number next to his name, which is kind of fun. Nice little way for the babyface to outsmart the heel. What do you think of that creative?
It's cute.
It's a little chilly. I mean, a little kiddie, a little campy, a little,
Yeah,
easy.
a little. I mean, but at least some thought went into it. I'm happy to hear that, but it's kind of childlike to me. How do you believe that? How do you
No,
get, I mean,
you're right. I prefer when Sting shot lasers out of his eyes at Jake the Snake.
Yeah.
And when you guys blew up that boat that Sting was on, you had that little person dressed like a shark. Way more believable there.
Hey, I didn't do it, brother.
No, I know. I'm just saying WCW, and listen, I know a lot of times we look back at this and you would say, and you did, it's a little childlike. We're trying to sell action figures. We're trying to sell kids shit. When you talk to Jim Herd, who I know has been villainized, but I think you should go check out Conversations with Conrad at adfreeshows.com. There was a lot of reasoning to a lot of the stuff that he did, including he got the core sponsorships on the ring posts. He got WCW a shoe deal with Ruse. He started to do business with Hershey's and M&M Mars, and there were a lot of big sponsorships that he brought to the table, and a lot of great matches happened on his watch. We were introduced to Vader. We were introduced to the Steiners. I mean, they became big stars with him.
You were introduced to Eric Bischoff.
You were introduced to Eric Bischoff. I mean, so there's a lot of really good stuff, including all the great stuff that happened with Flair and Steamboat, and then Terry Funk coming back and really having some of his biggest, most high profile on a national scene stuff. So there's a lot of good stuff that happened with Jim Herd, but it feels like he was onto something to me when he talked about, I wanted the Macho Man, because they had Hulk Hogan and we couldn't get a serious conversation with Hulk, but Macho was really, really popular with the kids. And that was an opportunity. And of course, eventually we saw it happen, but again, he was second fiddle to Hogan when he came over once again in WCW, but the kids, Hulk Hogan had them. Sting was WCW's best shot to capture those kids. And they tried time and time again, and it never worked as well as when they had Flair on top. So I understand that even though it didn't work, people could say, oh, well, it didn't work, and here's why, and blah, blah, blah. But even when things don't work, it doesn't mean they weren't worth a try. And so angling the kids and positioning storylines for kids and what have you, I think, hey, it's a worthwhile endeavor. And this, I agree, was aimed at kids, but it feels like a 30-minute sitcom or a Saturday morning cartoon, and it is for kids, but that doesn't mean it's still well done to me. I thought this was well done.
I agree. I agree with everything that you just said, but here's what I would say was the miscalculation by Jim Herd. You're not going to get a teen and preteen audience on TBS. If you go back and you look at the history of TBS and the content that got TBS to the dance and helped them grow as a superstation, if you go back and look at the programming and the way TBS was being positioned in its early stages and how it branded itself, you're not going to get a young audience on TBS. So you're trying to entertain a television audience that is inherently, because of the recent history of how your cable outlet was established, programmed, designed, and created to attract a much older demo. There was nothing wrong with the idea. The mistake was trying to attract teens and preteens to a network that was branded for 45 to 65-year-old audiences. And that wasn't Jim Herd's fault, because Jim Herd at that time, I would imagine, obviously, I was only there for a brief moment of Jim Herd's career, but if the idea was let's, and this is what separated, I'm not trying to put myself over Jim Herd here, I'm really, really not, but I've talked ad nauseum about how when I was mandated to create Nitro and go head to head with WWE. I knew I would fail if I tried to go after the same audience they were going after. Couldn't do it. Jim Herd tried. But how do you make that choice to invest the effort and the time of establishing yourself with an audience that you're never going to attract? No matter what you do, they're not coming to TBS. That was the flaw. It wasn't the flaw wasn't with the execution of the idea. The flaw was with the decision to try on that particular network. It just wasn't going to work. It was impossible. It was an impossible task to compete with the WWE for a teen and preteen audience at that time. They had a monopoly on it with wrestling, and the nature of the TBS network and the core audience that comes with it. There's just no kids watching that show, and that's why it failed.
So New Japan is going to announce that Rick Roode is going to be defending what they're calling the WCW International Heavyweight title against Hiroshi Hase at the Tokyo Gym. And then again, 8 days later, they tape some shows at Center Stage on March 3rd. They're going to air on April 2nd. That would have Sting and Pillman beat Roma and Orndorff when Sting pinned Roma. After the match, Roode would attack Sting, give him the Roode Awakening. And it's written here. Apparently, there is some heat because Roode is refusing to drop the strap to Sting, which was the company's original plan. I know you're not exactly booking television here in '94, but do you remember there being an issue with Rick Roode refusing to drop the belt?
Yeah, I'm not buying. I'm not going to agree with refusing. Rick, no. Now, he'll force the issue and force you to discuss it. He'll threaten. He would have threatened. He would have intimidated. But that's because he wasn't satisfied with his contribution to the story, or maybe he didn't understand the why of it all, which a lot of talent didn't care about. They just want to get their paychecks. A lot of, some talent doesn't ever ask why or what happens next. They just want to execute what they're asked to do and do it as well as they can and move on to the next job. But Rick Roode wasn't like that. He had to understand, and you had to give a sufficient answer. And by the way, Rick Roode wasn't alone in that respect. A lot of top talent that actually cared were in that same kind of, for different reasons, and they would manifest it or exhibit it different ways. But, whether it was Rick Roode or Hulk Hogan, the best way that I found eventually to creatively keep Hulk on the same page was to do what I should have done in the first place, which is make sure I've thought through the idea. Not just what happens leading up to something, but what happens afterwards. Where does that talent go afterwards? And what is the story? Even if the answer is you go away for 3 months, okay, why and how? And how do we explain my return? So when you lay out an idea, you lay out a complete idea to talent. Now, sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes the situation doesn't necessarily warrant it. But when you're working with top people, I've found the hard way, by the way, the hard way, I've found that the best way to convince somebody of your idea is not just laying out all the exciting things that are leading up to a moment, but to be able to answer the question because you've actually thought it through, not because you're flying by the seat of your pants and making shit up as you go, which comes back to haunt you, by the way. I've been there too. But when somebody asks you, a talent would ask you, okay, I understand this, and this is going to be the finish. But what happens then? If you've thought through what happens then, as well as you've thought through what happens leading up to then, chances are you're going to get talent on board. But more often than not, that's not the case. People don't think through the ideas to that extent. Go back to story structure and formula. But with Roode, if he wasn't satisfied, if you weren't answering the question why, which is another way of saying, what's my character's motivation? What are the stakes? What's the journey? They're not going to say it that way, but that's what they want to know. Why is the story a story? And how does it end and what happens then? Rick was one of those guys that would get in your face and force it. It's not the same thing as refusing. Rick didn't have the opportunity to refuse. Rick did have the opportunity and took advantage of it to force a conversation that should have taken place organically.
Well, ultimately, he is going to drop it. Before we talk there, we should mention that the whole issue with the lawsuit we talked about, fighting in a bar, Roode and Knobs figure out what this is about. So they countersued these two fellows for in excess of $10,000. The idea being, okay, you're suing me for 10 grand. I'm going to sue you for more than 10 grand. And before you know it, he finds himself in Japan and he's going to drop the belt to Hase in 16 minutes and 52 seconds. Of course, they're going to have a rematch. At the time, it's speculated in the newsletters, specifically the Observer, that they'll never acknowledge that this happened because it's probably going to switch back. So it won't be acknowledged in the U.S., but it's the first major singles heavyweight title won by Hase, who's probably the best worker in the company. It does create a rematch. As we mentioned earlier, it was going to happen 8 days later. It's a sellout, 8,500 fans. And what do you know? Rick Roode regains it. A little old school action there. It also makes the newsletter in early April. Rick Rude's manager on his last tour was named Lady Love, and she didn't look familiar at all, but she played a part in several of Rude's matches. In the match where he regained the title, Hase was on the top rope and she sat on the apron by him and hiked up her skirt, distracting him, allowing Roode to DDT Hase off the top, do a full Nelson front drop, similar to a Russian leg sweep, and then win by submission. She also distracted the ref in Roode's single match against Chono, allowing Roode to use a low blow, which led to a pin. Lady Love. How about that?
Who is she? Who is she?
I'm going to throw that in our Google machine right now.
Oh, I thought maybe there was a surprise at the end of that Lady Love segment because I was, who is Lady Love?
Right?
I don't know.
Let's keep it going and let's talk about what's next for Rick Roode here. For Spring Stampede, Sting is going to win the international title from Rick Roode in 13 minutes and 9 seconds. Harley Race would come out before the match so Vader could challenge the winner. Sting would whip Race over the top rope, clothesline Roode over the top rope. And a typical Roode match, he would say. He didn't love it, gave it 2 stars. Finally, though, Race gets a chair. Roode and Sting are back into the same position. And Race splits the back of Roode's head hard way with this chair. Several minutes after the match, they interview Roode, who's complaining about Vader, and they start getting into it. So we've got heel versus heel now. We're moving away from Rick Roode versus a babyface Flair or Rick Roode versus a babyface Sting. Now it's Rick Roode, the heel, versus a heel Vader. And ads were everywhere for the Slamboree pay-per-view, where it listed just one match. Rick Roode defends his WCW world title against Vader. Despite the fact that Roode was never WCW world champion, that's the wrong belt, and he's now dropped the title to Sting. WCW at times in this era, or for a lot of WCW's run, feels a little bit like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing.
Well, that was clearly true across the board. I would even suggest at Turner corporate as it relates to WCW. So it was trickle down, right? But Flair was booking now at this point, I'm pretty sure. And we both know and love Rick, but conflict isn't something that normally Rick at that point gravitated towards. It was the path of least resistance, compromise. Perhaps that's what Rick was in an impossible spot. We've talked about this before. When you're Ric Flair, you're Rick freaking Flair, and you have the success and the notoriety and the respect from many people, but not from all people who are a peer, right? Rick wasn't squeaky clean as it relates to his relationship with some talent because he was in the locker room with them. It's natural. Not everybody's going to love you. Now you take that guy that not everybody's that you're in a locker room with is going to necessarily love you. Some may not even like you, and some may not even trust you for valid and invalid reasons. But now you're the booker. So you try to make everybody happy. You try to keep the team together. And that eventually ends up being compromised. And that those compromises tend to dilute story and logic.
Next up, over in New Japan, Rick Roode is going to regain the WCW International title from Sting in 22 minutes and 48 seconds. And you're at ringside here. Sting came out to a big pop. The fans were booing Roode. Once again, Sting was distracted by Roode's manager / valet, Lady Love. And this is a big deal because I believe this is going to be the end of Rick Roode's in-ring career. I did not know until my research that you were over there for this. What do you remember?
First of all, the big pop wasn't for Sting. It was for me.
Oh,
okay.
So
you know.
Got
it. Where was this at? What city?
They were over in Japan.
I think, what month was it?
May 1st, I believe.
Yeah. We were in Fukuoka.
Yes.
Say that a bunch of times. Fukuoka. Wow. That was an amazing trip. I'd never been to Fukuoka, and in the spring it's the Cherry Blossom Festival and all that. I mean, it's beautiful. You know, there's no other way to say it. The city was beautiful at night. The way they lit up the trees along the riverbanks was just gorgeous. And the Fukuoka Dome, where it was located, was near a big, beautiful kind of public park along the river. I think it was along the river. And they have this, basically it was there's a name for it. I can't think of it right now, but it's like this old style of Japanese street cooking, if you will. So, but it was everywhere, and you could just go from, kiosk to kiosk to kiosk, having all this really, in some cases, ancient Japanese food and the way it was prepared, and some of it modern. Obviously, there was so much, but it was like going to like 50 acres of some of the best Japanese food you could find. And after the event, we went to that, we were out on the street, and that was a fun trip. Such a fun trip. Lori was there with me. I don't think we took the kids to that one. So it was just Lori and I, but we had an absolute blast hanging out with Masa Saito and his wife, Michi. It was great. That's what I remember. That and the fact that the Japanese audience, I was over with the Japanese audience.
Let me describe the scene here. This is, if you've watched many tapes from Japan, you've probably seen this before. It's where they have the ring elevated. And if you watched WrestleMania 6, you may have even seen it there. So the ring itself is on a platform, but so are rather the mats around the ring. And then, a few feet down, there's the floor to the arena where they would have a guardrail and fans and seating and what have you. But they elevate the ring either to line up with the ramp or to have a better seat for everyone, or to shoot over people's heads, or just make sure that everyone has a better line of sight, whatever. But there comes a time in a match where Rick Roode is on the outside of the ring selling, and here comes Sting flying at him. And they've done this a million times. It's an over the top rope dive that Sting was famous for. But unlike in America, where everything is flat almost all the time, there's a platform here in Japan. And so when Roode goes to catch him and they fall, they don't just fall on the platform. They don't just fall on the flat surface. It's a combination of both. And unfortunately, all of Sting's weight is what's going to keep that momentum going. And the exact corner of that platform, which I don't know, 12, 18 inches, whatever it is. That's where Rick falls. So instead of falling flat on his back, like most wrestlers are trained to their whole life, he's trying to do that, but unfortunately the surface is not flat. And it is a perfect combination for a really, really long-term injury for Rick Roode. This effectively ends his in-ring career. And you were there, but I'm sure in that moment, it's probably hard to know what's real and what's Memorex, right? Like on some level, it could have just been part of the match. And that's maybe what keeps us going. You know, we always want to know, okay, well, that was real. Well, this was real. And allegedly, Roode blamed Sting for being careless when he dove. And there were hurt feelings and I believe heat between the two. And Sting says that the guys made up with each other when Roode ultimately came back to WCW years later. But what do you remember of this injury when it happened? Did you know that night, later that night, or on the trip back that he was hurt?
I really didn't, because I was there on business before the event in Fukuoka, and I didn't travel with talent on the way home. I was there for a couple more days afterwards. So I didn't really interface with Rick or Sting or anybody, very little bit at the event. But again, you keep in mind, now you've got, guys from WCW who aren't necessarily fluent in Japanese, laying out matches and working with, Japanese who aren't necessarily fluent in English or American version of English. So that's a little busy at that time. And I wasn't involved in the creative the day of. Obviously knew what was going to happen in terms of finishes, but in terms of laying shit out, I wasn't a part of any of that. So I had very little interaction with mostly anybody other than New Japan office people who I was there, watching with. So no, I didn't know about it till I got back.
The Observer had this to say: for the past few weeks, problems had surfaced regarding Roode's tenure in WCW. At least some of the problems were brewing by late April, which made many question the decision to go along with the original plan of putting the international belt back on Roode at the Dome. Roode then missed house shows after the Dome with back and neck injuries, said to be suffered in the Dome match against Sting, although Roode has really been plagued by those injuries since late 92, which is probably the major reason to blame for his substantial drop in form since that point. Because of his big money contract, rumored to be well in excess of $300,000 per year, the size of which needed to be corporately justified, guaranteeing he'd always be in a top position, combined with his matches consistently being below par, there was much disgruntlement with his situation. Roode himself was unhappy and reportedly at one point requested being bought out of his deal, like Jimmy Garvin in 92. There was also speculation Roode's injuries would lead him to sitting out for a lengthy period of time and collect on his Lloyd's of London disability. As of press time, nothing regarding Roode's immediate future appeared to have been finalized, and numerous possibilities exist. If Roode is through with the company, it appears that at the pay-per-view, they will announce the International Board of Governors reviewed the film from the Dome match, and because of the distraction of Lady Love that led to the finish, that the title will be returned to Sting, who would then defend the title against Vader at Slamboree. This will work out fine since it's a better match, even if it's been done numerous times already on pay-per-view. Most of those matches have been very good to great. If not, the Roode Vader match will take place as planned. The initial plan was for that match to have a disputed finish, perhaps a double countout, and lead to Flair versus Vader and Roode versus Sting at the Clash of the Champions, with both belts at stake in both matches. If Roode appears at Slamboree and loses the title to Vader, that's probably a signal that that's his final WCW match. If he retains it, that's a signal everything's been worked out. So that leads us to, I think, where we're getting to with your big story.
No, wait a minute. Before we do that, because you just laid a lot of stuff out there.
Yes.
All of it was based on bullshit and lies and distortion and fantasy booking from a childlike adult mind.
Okay.
You lost me. I was listening pretty carefully right up until the point when Dave reported that there had to be justification from WCW to Turner Broadcasting that would suggest that Rick Roode would always be in a top spot. Like that was some kind of conditional representation by WCW to upper level Turner management. That is a lie. That is a fucking made up bunch of bullshit. There's not even anything close to that had ever existed. There had been times when my predecessors would try to get money for certain talents and probably not be able to. But there was never a precedent or representation by anybody in WCW to anybody in Turner Broadcasting that a certain talent would remain at a certain level in order to justify said salary. There is not one word of, even remote word of truth to any of that. Therefore, everything that followed it is garbage. Garbage. And this is my issue with people like Dave Meltzer, who write this shit, sell this shit, and do it in a way that makes people believe that he actually has information that's nothing more than it's his infant-like baby wrestling mind. It's ridiculous. None of that is true. It's all, we just wasted 40 fucking minutes of time or 20 minutes of time talking about something that isn't true. None of it.
So on the Torch, they would report this Saturday, according to a report out of Orlando's worldwide TV tapings, Roode handed over the WCW International title belt and quit wrestling due to his health and frustration with WCW. Roode is believed to have an insurance policy in case of injury, which, much like fellow Minnesotans Kurt Hennig, Nikita Koloff, and Road Warrior Animal, who have collected on policies in recent years. WCW deserves credit for learning from this experience, as they have found to be true what many predicted. Booking 3 months ahead of time is too stressful and risky, given the volatile nature of the wrestling industry. This week's tapings in Orlando, unlike the past two go-arounds, they did not commit themselves to any major angles, which is good for their own sanity. Now, there's a pretty famous story that's been whispered about or talked about. This whole Roode handed over the WCW International title belt. You didn't tease that there was a trunk involved, but I did, because I think that's the story. Is that the story? And can you fill in the blanks?
Honestly, I'm kind of in a state of mental vertigo with regard to what all was going on at this particular time, where Roode and I met at the trunk of his car. But it was a very tense situation with Roode. And a lot of it had to do, once again, with Ric Flair. Don't know why. Probably because Rick was the booker, Flair, at the time. And there was inherent resentment or lack of trust or whatever. I don't know. Rick at the time was Roode. Rick Roode at the time was pretty miserable to deal with. I can assume there was a lot of reasons for it. But he was less than cooperative and wasn't going to give the belt over. I think he was supposed to turn it in at a booking meeting or a talent meeting or something in Orlando. Wouldn't do it. Calls were made. Doug Dillinger called him. I eventually called him. He came down and he was pissed. And I don't remember the verbiage, right? The exact verbiage. I could make some shit up and make you believe I remember it, but I don't. I'm going to shoot straight about this. It came down to, if you want the belt, come and get it, to me. And it was said in front of others who were in the booking room. And people were genuinely not too sure where Rick's head was at, because he was in a tough spot mentally and emotionally. I'll go back to what I said earlier in the show. I just didn't think Rick Roode was going to shoot me. It's not like we were best friends. We weren't. We were friends, but not that close. But I was pretty sure he wasn't going to shoot me when he challenged me to come down, and if I wanted the belt, come and get it. he left the room. I followed after him. I got down to his car. He opened up his trunk. There was the belt underneath a loaded 45. I was kind of like, oh, this is weird. Again, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't laughing it off. Trust me. I didn't want to upset him. I didn't want to, suggest that I wasn't taking him seriously, because he might make me take him seriously, and that would have escalated the situation. So I was, as respectful as I could be, but I honestly wasn't afraid I was going to get shot. Reached in, grabbed the gun, 2, 3, grabbed the belt with the other hand, he handed it to me, put the gun back in the trunk, closed the trunk, and that was the end of it. But it was a moment.
And that was in Orlando.
Yeah.
Hypothetically, do you think Roode got one of those guns for 4 tickets to WCW?
That's one. That is a good one.
Sting and Roode have still been advertised for house shows, even though they're not going to be there. Roode is hurt, obviously. Sting is out filming Thunder in Paradise, but we're just lying to fans in both shows, saying, oh, they missed their flight back from Japan. Meltzer would write, backstage, Roode was still the biggest story. Roode was in Philadelphia, apparently because he wanted to fulfill his contractual obligations, even though he wouldn't be able to wrestle on the show because of the injury. While Roode was clearly working with an injury for more than a year, you'll hear a lot of skepticism about the severity of this injury that was supposedly the source at the Dome. The idea being, we knew he was working hurt, but now with television cameras rolling and it's a big production and he's maybe not happy with his creative or his compensation or what have you, maybe this is just an excuse. And as with everything else in wrestling, politics pop up. Quote, it came just days after Roode had stated he wouldn't put over Flair, Hogan, or Vader. Apparently, the original idea for the July 17th pay-per-view was a tag match where Roode was going to do the job at the end. While we don't have details on the situation, Roode and Flair got into a serious argument in Philadelphia again, and Roode refused to do whatever he was supposed to do in regards to going out there when he was being stripped of the title, which is why it created yet another in a seemingly endless list of nonsensical angles that poor Nick Bockwinkel has been saddled with, trying to pull off believably. Before the pay-per-view match, Bockwinkel announced the International Board of Directors had nullified the title change in Japan because Roode used the belt as a weapon and because he came off the top rope with a knee drop, which is a lame remnant of the Bill Watts era rulebook. Fans largely booed this and chanted ripoff. Sting then refused to accept the belt unless he could win it in the ring against Vader, which only slightly quelled the audience. I understand when something like this happens in wrestling that everybody sort of goes, But the timing of the injury and the conversation, allegedly, I won't put over Flair, Hogan, or Vader. Did you believe that, especially since you were there at that show in Japan, and you said, I didn't really notice. Did you think that perhaps Roode was unhappy with the creative and knew he had this Lloyd's of London thing, as all those Minnesota boys had cashed in and felt like this was his opportunity? Or do you think it really was a legitimate injury?
I think it was a legitimate injury that was very convenient.
Yes.
A little bit of both. Because if you fast forward a couple years later, Rick Roode, after the Montreal screw job, Rick Roode calls me on my phone Sunday night. I'm sitting at home in Atlanta watching TV with my wife and kids, not watching WWE's pay-per-view, the Montreal screw job. I get a call from Rick Roode. He wants to come back, but he wants to come back and wrestle. So the injury had either healed up sufficiently or was never really that serious to begin with. But Rick had already taken the Lloyd's of London money. And once you do that, you can't undo that. You can't put that bullet back in the gun. Well, you can, but you have to pay back Lloyd's of London the amount that you were paid under that insurance policy in order not to be legally in violation of that settlement agreement. So that's why I think it could have been a little bit of both.
So the Observer would get some more clarity. And they would say the problem between Flair and Roode at Slamboree is that Roode wanted to do an interview about losing the belt, where he would complain about being stripped because he won with illegal means. Because when he lost the title to Sting, it was because Harley Race interfered. Flair didn't like that idea because he thought it would take legitimacy away from the Sting Vader match being for the belt, since Roode's explanation actually made too much sense, and because it would get Roode over when there were no future plans for him. Flair had his own idea of what he wanted Roode to say. Roode didn't like it and walked out hours before the show. And of course, there are tons of rumors, even in the Torch, saying Roode's going to show up in the WWF. They're desperate for a new big name heel. Even though the steroid trial's coming up, people are not going to be surprised if he shows up there. The Torch would chime in a few weeks later and say the Roode Flair argument at Slamboree was said to have been dominated the time of the Flair Bischoff conversation. I guess you guys were trying to plan for the show, but in an effort to plan for the show, you wind up just talking about this argument, and that the argument lasted 30 minutes before Roode stormed out. Do you remember this Slamboree argument with Flair and Roode, and were you involved in it at all?
No. I mean, that sounds like I've never been in a 30-minute argument with anybody.
Yeah.
Where would that come from? Who was timing it? Who had the clock? What the fuck? No. Who would have suggested that to Dave? Or did Dave just make it up?
Well, that
never been in a 30-minute argument with anybody.
That was Wade.
Wade, or including my wife. Never been in a 30-minute. I would get in an argument and
it's 5 minutes and then you're done. Yeah.
And then I'm done.
Yeah.
Or I'll leave and think about it and come back and say, okay, I'm sorry, or whatever. Never been locked in a room having a 30-minute argument with anybody. I don't have that kind of patience.
The match happened where the injury happened on May 1st. It aired 3 weeks later. And so by the time it aired, everything that happened had been negated. And here's what Dave wrote. Who the hell is Lady Love? Same thing you and I asked. Sting did a big dive over the top rope and Roode landed with his back halfway on the platform and the other half on nothing, since it was the edge of the platform, which looks like it could have hurt him badly. If Roode claims an injury from that move, his case looks awfully good on tape, which I agree with. And ultimately, he returns, or he's slated to return in September. It doesn't happen because he winds up filing a $630,000 lawsuit against WCW stemming from his departure and his injury. And it's written in the Observer, the reason he didn't go to the WWF is because he is actively collecting disability on his Lloyds of London policy and, of course, the lawsuit. So chat me up. How do you remember it coming to an end here with him and WCW?
Let's take a quick break on that note.
Okay.
1 minute, maybe 2.
3, 2.
I don't remember how it all, I remember the incident. I remember it turning legal. And you have to understand, in the position that I was in, once something went to legal, once there was litigation involved, I couldn't participate unless I was, being deposed or something. I had no conversation. I couldn't have a conversation with Rick Roode. That would have been inappropriate. Once somebody pulls the legal trigger, then it's only the attorneys that are engaged in conversation. And anything else I would have done behind the scenes would have been inappropriate. So got to legal, lawsuits filed, I'm out. I'm done.
Something phenomenal happened. November 28th, Center Stage. There's a series of tapings that are going to air on like the 10th, the 17th, and the 24th of December. When all of a sudden, Curt Hennig and Rick Roode show up unannounced, and they're wearing suits and ties. They sit in the crowd. Security is keeping fans away from them. And between matches, this is from the Torch, WCW Vice President Eric Bischoff came out and shook hands with them as if he had not talked to them and did not know they were coming. Tony Schiavone also said hello to them during a break. Eventually, ring announcer Gary Capetta announced their presence to the crowd. They signed autographs and were cordial. this may or may not actually appear on camera when the taping airs, but the last we heard, Roode was suing WCW for making him wrestle despite knowing he was injured and causing further damage, causing him to lose salary. Hennig was said not to have come to terms with WCW when they wanted him to be Ric Flair's masked man and face Hulk Hogan at Starrcade. The idea being, these guys simply showed up to cause a ruckus. And I love this. I mean, I know that years later, Enzo showed up at a WWF pay-per-view and was hidden, but across from the hard cam and in the second row and tried to make a spectacle of himself. But where everything in wrestling is what's real and what's a work, the idea that these guys just showed up and sat in the crowd and you came out and acknowledged them, that's pretty fucking cool. What do you remember about this?
Very little. I remember it happening, but it was not a major, creative decision, and there wasn't a lot of discussion about it. Like, if you wouldn't have brought it up, I don't think it would have ever crossed my mind that it even happened. So it was just a moment.
It was a way to get people talking in the newsletters and the hotlines, and
yeah, it was just a little, I hate to even call it a stunt, but it was a promotional stunt, but it wasn't something that was designed to be, a pivot point or an inciting moment or incident to launch a story from. It was just, hey, yeah, cool. This will be fun. Let's do this, see what happens.
Well, that's what we did today. We wanted to do this and see what happens. Of course, we're not done with the Rick Roode story. We've still got to talk about when Rick Roode came back in main wrestling history as part of the NWO. But before he did, boy, he had some controversial statements that we're going to be sure to talk about next time here on the show. Eric, I don't know that you'll recall this because, well, you had a lot of other stuff going on. But I do want to mention, because it just tickled me that, and this is a different era, the internet was really in its infancy at the time. It's not like it is these days. But Rick Roode would find himself in 1996, before he's with the WWF, before he's even flirting with WCW, he's still on the outside looking in. And he does an appearance on America Online back when that was a thing. I guess it still is, according to Bruce Pritchard's email. But he had comments about Hulk Hogan. Quote, "I never had that high of an opinion on Hulk because I feel he's taken more from the business than he's given." When he was asked about Eric Bischoff, he says, quote, "I have a picture in my mind that I can't seem to bring words to explain. I don't know legally what I can say online, but I know that in my opinion, Eric Bischoff is lower than snake shit and not half as pretty." I love that. I'm not sure what I can say here, so let me insult him and curse. Tremendous. And we're going to continue our story on Rick Roode Part 2 at some point in the future. We're going to talk about that famous moment where he showed up on Nitro and he was already on a taped Raw. We'll talk about, I believe there was another story you have that unfortunately happened after Rick had passed. A lot more to unpack on Rick Roode, but I think as far as breaking down what happened in his first run in WCW, we covered it about as thoroughly as we could today, dude.
I really enjoyed it. It brought back a lot of memories, and it was an amazing time in the industry. But the story behind Rick Roode and his involvement in WCW is interesting, not only because Rick was somebody that I respected, and I considered a friend, but man, talk about one of the more, we were right on the precipice of doing something really big.
Yeah.
And even before Nitro and all of that, there was a sense of momentum during this period of time. And when you're in a wrestling office, or I'll say this better, in the position that I was in the situation that WCW was in, and the fact that we, around this era with Rick Roode, we're just beginning to actually start to build a little bit of momentum, only raised everybody's temperature, good and bad. And I think what we've covered about Rick is both the good and the bad with Rick Roode, both the good and the bad, because the stakes got a lot higher and the emotions got more tense, and the story kind of reflects that.
Next week, we're going to be switching gears. We're going to talk about Final Resolution 2011. It's Rob Van Dam and Christopher Daniels. It's Robbie E. and Eric Young. It's Crimson and Matt Morgan taking on D'Angelo De Niro and Devon. We've got Austin Aries and Kid Cash, Gail Kim and Mickey James, James Storm and Kurt Angle. Then Jeff Hardy taking on Jeff Jarrett in a steel cage match. But then in the main event, after we just talked about it earlier, an Iron Man match between Bobby Roode and AJ Styles. I don't know that you're going to love this show as much as you enjoyed our Rick Roode show today, but that's what we're doing next week, Eric. And then in 2 weeks, we'll be doing a watch along from the go home episode of Nitro right before Roddy Piper and Hulk Hogan hooked it up at Starrcade 96. We'll round out the year talking about Goldberg's 1999. And then at some point after the first of the year, or maybe as a bonus in there somewhere, we'll put a bow on Rick Roode with Rick Roode Part 2. This was a fun episode, man. I'm looking forward to a strong finish to the year. We've got New Year's Eve right around the corner, and we know now that Alabama's going to be playing Cincinnati. Georgia is going to be playing Michigan. And before we clicked record today, you've told me that you've actually been watching more college football. What's your prediction in the playoffs? Get on the record now. Who will win, Alabama or Cincinnati?
You've got me, brother. And I watched a little bit of the Cincinnati game the other day. You've got me. I'm hooked. I'm a Roll Tide sumbitch now. I never thought it would. I'm 66 freaking years old, and I've never been interested in college football until you came along in my life. I sent you a text yesterday letting you know what I was reading and what I was doing simultaneously while I was watching Alabama on television on a Saturday afternoon. Never in my life have I been a fan of college football, more or less Alabama football, but hence here I am. What the hell?
I concur, Eric. Alabama's going to beat Cincinnati, but the other game, now here's where you got to put your thinking cap on. You going with Michigan and Harbaugh and Ric Flair? Or are you going with Kirby Smart and Georgia and, well, Ric Flair? Because he says both are his favorite teams. So who knows?
He's a hoe. Rick is just a hoe. His favorite team is whoever will fly him in and let him down on the sidelines to woo himself up a good time. That's who he's rooting for. I'm going for Georgia, not for any other reason that I watched them play yesterday. And they did play a pretty good game,
yes,
despite the fact that they lost. I thought going into that first quarter, or actually I thought during the first quarter that, after the struggle I saw Alabama have last time I watched them play, where they went into like 72 fucking overtimes, I thought, man, this Georgia team's tougher than people give them credit for. And yes, they lost yesterday, but I can't wait to see them play Michigan. And we'll see can you imagine Ric Flair? He's going to be running back and forth across the field to both sides of the bench. He's going to keep his bases covered, brother, because, whoa, that's what we do.
I love you for that. He's turned more times in the Big Show. He is the nature boy. And by the way, he's got a podcast now. The rumor and innuendo is that him and Mark Madden are having a good time. And Lord knows I am here talking to you about Rick Roode. Looking forward to next week, Final Resolution 2011. And it's going to be a great, strong finish to the year here on 83 Weeks. Hope you guys will check us out on adfreeshows.com. You get all these shows early and ad-free. And you just did a whole locked and loaded thing. I think we've got some mean tweet receipts coming up. And right now is an excellent time to join the ad-free shows family. You can sign up and do an annual, or you can gift a subscription to the wrestling fan in your life. Probably the best value in wrestling right now. Wouldn't you agree, Eric?
Absolutely. I mean, the amount of content, the amount of content that the entire team that's contributing over at adfreeshows.com, I can't keep up with it. For sure, I can't keep up with it. I mean, you just talk about over-delivering, particularly when it comes to value. You'll never find anything like it. You know, some of the conversations with Conrad, things that you've done are really important with regard to the history of wrestling. But there's also the fun stuff, like the mean tweets and other things that we do. Tony Schiavone's a blast. He's funny as hell. Entertaining to watch anything that Tony does on adfreeshows.com. It's just a blast. And, for the dollar, I don't think there's a better value in sports entertainment.
Check it out, adfreeshows.com. Until next time, he is at E Bischoff. I am at Hey, it's Conrad. We are at 83 Weeks on Twitter, and we're also out of time. See you next week right here on 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff.
Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell so you get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And go save yourself some money right now. If you're in a 30-year loan or you have credit card debt, it's not a matter of if I can save you money. It's a matter of how much. Find out right now for free at SaveWithConrad.com.